Useless ancient instincts we all still have. As much as we like to believe that as a species we are civilized and technologically advanced, in reality, a lot of modern day society and our day-to-day life is still heavily influenced and, quite honestly, controlled by primal instincts, deeply ingrained in our brains over hundreds of thousands of years of human development. But in this video, we're going to discuss examples of primal instincts that were helpful at the time that today are quite useless or, in some cases, making our lives harder. Let's get started. I would guarantee that most people watching this video, if not everybody watching this video, enjoys a sweet treat. And while some of us enjoy a sweet treat guilt-free, some of us also feel bad that we quite often crave such sugary things that we know aren't good for us. But the reason most of us crave such sugary and sweet foods and drinks was at one point in time crucial for our survival. During the ancient prehistoric days of humanity, food was a luxury and likely the most valuable currency. And it's for that reason that humans were really eating anything and everything they could get their hands on. But not all foods are built the same. Eating bugs and leaves is cool, but nothing quite hits the spot to a caveman like something extremely sweet or something extremely fatty. And the reason for this is simple. Sugar specifically is extremely valuable to the body because it gives your body a quick boost of energy, something that many foods aren't able to provide. And because of this, your body responded extremely positive to this food source that was able to give you such a quick hit of energy. Even if your body wasn't in dire need of energy at the time, your body is able to store that excess energy in the form of fat, meaning that at any time, at any place, if there was anything sweet around, your body knew to consume it there and then. And at the time, this could have meant life or death. Now, unfortunately, the stakes today are not nearly as high. And I would say that most people, if not everybody watching this video, does not struggle with food scarcity either at all or definitely not to the extent that cavemen did. Meaning that eating the bag of gummy bears on your nightstand isn't life or death. It's really just how much willpower do you have to overcome your primal urges. In today's world, eating anything sweet you can get your hands on almost has the opposite effect, because at best, this excess sugar is just going to put extra weight on your body. And at worst, it's actually going to have a detrimental effect on your overall health. The complete opposite of the intent of this instinct in primal times. So if you ever feel bad about having low discipline when it comes to sweets, it's because a caveman hundreds of thousands of years ago realized that berries and honey give you a kick of energy that bugs, leaves, and animal fats just couldn't do. Oh, and as a quick bonus, the reason why everything in the world today is so sugary is directly related to the human instinct of craving excess sugar. Humans don't crave sugar because everything in the modern diet is full of sugar, because these companies realized long ago that humans fundamentally crave sugar. And if these food companies could provide it to you, you are very unlikely to say no. And that's another trend you'll notice in this video. Not only are your instincts personally working against yourself, but other entities are using your instincts against you for profit, which is kind of dystopian. Another more dystopian part of modern day life is the fact that even though we are living in the best time ever to exist as a human, we likely deal with the most issues ever. And this is because humans have a deeply ingrained negative bias, which, like you guessed, in primal times served a crucial purpose in our survival. But in the modern day, in a world full of complexity, it only makes our life that was supposed to be easier much harder. I would argue that most people understand that they should be grateful for everything they have in their life. But realistically, gratitude is something you kind of have to remind yourself to have and do. And this is because your mind isn't naturally programmed to be like, oh, this is so great, this is awesome. No, your mind is actually programmed for the opposite. The ancient primal world was filled with real immediate dangers, natural disasters, predators, other tribes, famine, and so forth. You and your loved ones' lives were consistently under attack. And because of this, the best way to survive in a world where everything could and would kill you is to be aware of those things and to primarily focus on the negative or dangerous aspects of life, which at the time was a lot more common than anything else. And while this bias as a caveman was extremely crucial, in the modern day where almost none of these threats exist, we are still dealing with the consequences of this bias. Just think about it. If there was two cavemen in prehistoric times, one who went on a walk and saw, oh, there's a dangerous thing, I'm not gonna go there. Oh, I stepped on something sharp, this place could be dangerous. I'm gonna go home and remember this and just, keep this in the back of my mind. Versus a caveman that went on a walk and was just like, oh, that's a pretty tree. Oh, cool. That's a cool looking lion running directly towards me. That's majestic. Which of the two do you think is going to survive? And I mean, the answer is kind of obvious. But like I mentioned, tiger attacks and starvation are fortunately not much of a risk for many people today. So we transition this worry and this part of our brain onto other aspects of more modern life. Job security, social status, rejection, failure, the opinions of others. And because the world that we live in is just so complex and there is so much to think about, And because the negativity bias is an instinct so deeply ingrained within our psyche, if you don't consciously try to counteract this negativity bias, it could lead to some very serious consequences. And it's extremely easy to spiral into overthinking and stressing and, coming up with worst case scenarios and ultimately developing things such as anxiety or depression. And a common example of this negativity bias is, once we lay down on our bed and close our eyes, all of a sudden every horrible thing that happened to us ever comes to mind. Keep in mind, in ancient times, before you go to bed, it's helpful to have a checklist of everything you notice today that could be bad, but in modern times, it's just gonna make going to bed harder and possibly damage your self-esteem. And if that was the first time you've ever done something like that, then you probably experienced a lot of fear, specifically fear of the unknown, which is likely one of the oldest human instincts we all have to this very day. Our ancestors had to essentially trial and error every aspect of life always, and the stakes were typically life or death. And because of this, the best way to mitigate as much risk as possible was to simply stick with what you know and avoid what you didn't know, which led to the development of the fear of the unknown. During ancient times, exploring a place that was dark and you couldn't quite see, encountering an animal that you were unfamiliar with, or even seeing weather that you haven't quite seen before, all could very well lead to the death of you and anybody around you. Meaning that the best way to stay alive was to avoid and fear any of these things you were unfamiliar with. And this instinct is still around to this very day. But once again, in modern times, this instinct isn't helpful and is often counterproductive. And while I would definitely say that there is an argument for the fear of the unknown being helpful today, there is still places where it isn't helpful. Specifically when it comes to exploring opportunities that could ultimately be beneficial. Like, let's say, starting a new relationship, trying a new food, going to a new city, moving, meeting new people. In the modern day, when things are so safe and so civilized, there are so many amazing opportunities to come out of exploring the unknown and seeking discomfort and truly trying to overcome this instinct. But the reality is just that. This is an instinct that has to be overcome to experience these things. And because of this, there is a saying that I think is rather accurate, is that most people would rather experience a familiar hell than an unknown heaven. And it's interesting because even though in that hypothetical that the unknown situation would be objectively better, because it's unknown, it's still scarier than dealing with something objectively worse that you're at least familiar with. But it wasn't only the unknown that our ancestors were afraid of. There was actually quite a few fears that our ancestors hold that we still hold today. Another example being the fear of failure. Now, once again, there is instances where this fear is still helpful in the modern day, but as a whole, the exaggerated fear of failure is more detrimental to people than it is helpful. In ancient times, goals were simple and immediate. If you were on a hunt, your goal was to secure an animal. If you're looking to reproduce, your goal is to secure a mate. If you're looking for shelter, your goal is to find a warm and comfortable place. And in all of these instances, if you failed to meet your goal, your life or your bloodline was done. And those stakes are pretty high. And over hundreds of thousands of years of development, our brain began to realize that if we really want something, we cannot accept failure as an option. And while in the modern day, many of our goals are not life or death at all, a lot of people still act like them. Doing worse on an assignment than you anticipated, not getting the promotion you wanted, having an application denied for almost anything. All of these things are uncomfortable and upsetting, but in most cases, they are not life or death. Although some people still act like they are, but it is so ingrained in our being to have that exaggerated fear of failing that typically only holds us back and will cause us to feel a sense of dread when in reality the situation may be mildly infuriating or potentially disappointing, but definitely not life or death. But another consequence of failure in ancient times beyond just immediate death was also a loss of social status. You see, humans have always been tribal people, pack animals, if you will. And within packs or groups, there is a hierarchy. And within hierarchies, there is status, which determines where you stand on the food chain. In ancient times, we were extremely motivated to seek status, not to satisfy our egos, but to ensure our survival. Because in ancient tribes, the higher status individuals typically got the most benefits, the best shelter, the most food, and so on. And the opposite was also true. If you were low status in the tribe, you would be getting scraps. You would be living in the worst of places. And in severe situations, you would be outright outcast from the group, essentially being left for dead. And for that reason, it's reasonable to understand why seeking social status was so important in prehistoric times. But as we all know, this is not a habit that's gone away. And in modern times, people seek status more than ever, while, interestingly, the stakes are much lower. Sure, in the modern day, there is so many benefits to having status. Celebrities, for example, have access to the best of everything. They get treated better than everybody else. They can afford everything and still get things for free. And there are definitely benefits to that in the modern day. day, although I would argue it doesn't guarantee your survival anymore. Because in the modern day, you don't need social status to live. An entry-level job, a simple side hustle, or even a small business are all things that could sustain you and provide you a comfortable and potentially even abundant life, with status being completely out of the equation. And sure, this drive for status could still give you a better life, but it also could send you on a completely meaningless pursuit that at the end of your life you realize wasn't worth it at all. And I would say in most cases, this drive is almost solely egoic and not survival focused. And I think one of the most common instances that we all experience in regards to this drive for status is how we compare ourselves to others consistently. In a world full of social media, we are force-fed other people's lives on a daily basis. And typically that experience looks like, wow, they're doing better than me. And the reason we do this is because we are perceiving them to be higher status than us. And it means that we are at risk of being evicted from the group and getting less than we may need to survive. And as we know, this mindset of comparison and seeing ourselves as less than others who only present the best parts of their life typically leads to anxiety, depression, and many of the other common consequences of having a primal brain in an extremely advanced world. Which is why I believe this drive to be completely useless, if not counterproductive. Because in most cases, you just feel worse about yourself, even though you are completely capable of surviving and having a meaningful and happy life. But even if you don't crave being a high status individual, you typically at the very least crave fitting in. Which brings us to the next ancient instinct, the human impulse of adopting a herd mentality. As we just mentioned in the previous instinct, humans in tribes were safer, and humans on their own were not. And while climbing the social ladder is one goal, even maintaining where you are is an entirely separate goal. The human brain evolved in tribes and closely monitored the group, copying all of their behavior because they see that these other people are alive, so they're gonna do what these other living, surviving people are doing, because that's really the ultimate goal. And because of that, most people were on the same page. While at the same time, individuals who showed attributes that weren't directly in line with the tribe, whether it be doing something that resulted in their instant death or simply doing something that the tribe didn't approve of, let's say not reciprocating sharing food or not contributing, would result in being exiled, which was essentially a death sentence. If you notice that everybody does one thing and the people who don't do that thing either die or get kicked out of the group, you're going to quickly learn that it's best to do what everybody else is doing and not stray too far from that. In prehistoric times, it meant coexistence. But once again, today, the stakes are not nearly as high. But that doesn't stop our brain from trying to keep us in line with the greater group. Everybody in one shape or another fears rejection. Whether it be talking to somebody you find attractive, trying to sell something, or simply trying to find a place that you belong. Nobody wants to be told no or that they don't fit in. And this is something that we experience from a very young age and most people carry through the rest of their life. And while herd mentality can manifest itself in a lot of ways, it's most commonly experienced by simply not wanting to stand out or make too many waves or rock the boat. So if you ever feel bad about your desire to fit in and want to be somebody else or want to have other attributes so you could be more like others, it's not that you hate yourself or it's not that you're wrong. It's simply the biology of your brain telling you that if you are more like others, you will have a higher chance of living. And while that's not really the case today, your brain doesn't really know the difference. And similar to our fear of the unknown, this herd mentality in most cases in the modern time holds us back rather than protects us. We stop ourselves from pursuing the things we truly love or doing things we really want to do. It stops us from taking risks or doing things that seem out of the norm. The goal of this herd mentality is to keep us alive, not happy. And what that looks like today is simply doing something that you know is safe, even if you don't like to do it, because doing the thing you want to do might not give you that same safe result. And that could apply to a career, a lifestyle, or really anything. Your brain has decided that the safest way to live is going with the path of least resistance. And what that typically looks like is doing what everybody else is doing. And this is an ancient instinct that is very evident in the modern day. Almost as evident, at least, as our need for control. I would say a good majority of people at some point in their life struggle with having a pretty strong to severe need for control in at least some aspect of their life. Whether it be some sort of power trip or perfectionism or simply a sheer need for things to go their way. The ancient human mind craved control because it was predictable, and it craved that simplicity and predictability, and how that manifested was learning to seek order and trying to create a routine in a world that was completely unpredictable, but somehow simultaneously seasonal and cyclical. And how this looked in ancient times was using this need for this control to establish routines that allowed life to exist, following migration patterns of animals that would sustain your tribe's life, understanding the seasons and following weather patterns and predicting what happens when you saw a certain cloud, controlling the amount of wood you put on your fire to ensure it never never went out. All of these actions are rooted in a desire for routine, order, and ultimately control. But in the modern day, this need for control has manifested rather differently. And the biggest way that our need for control hinders us in the modern day is by people trying to control factors that are out of their control. And this need that people feel that ultimately leads them to have extreme stress and anxiety about certain situations. In ancient times, the only thing we could control was our actions. And our need for control was based in our actionable pursuit of living. But in the modern day, with infinite information at our fingertips in a world that is more complex than our brain could ever perceive, this need for control oversteps its usefulness and becomes a hindrance, whether it be just being socially unlikable because you are too bossy, or being unable to enjoy something because it is not to your exact liking, or spending your free time worrying about something that you have no control over simply because you desire it going a certain way. And these negative feelings associated with feeling out of control leads to a negative spiral, because if you feel out of control, you feel weak, you feel less. And it's through these negative emotions that our brain develops pattern recognition, so it knows exactly what to avoid, so it cannot feel bad, so it cannot die. And this brings us to the final instinct on this list. Looking for patterns that are basically not there. This instinct comes from our brain's natural desire to want to make sense of this world we live in. And in prehistoric times, spotting a pattern could make the difference between your existence and your very quick non-existence. If you notice that every time you eat a certain red berry, you throw it violently, you'll probably begin to avoid that. If you notice a pattern of everybody who wrestles with a tiger turning into red jelly, you're not going to wrestle with tigers. And from these examples, we can see the obvious advantage of pattern recognition. It's our brain's quick and easy way to quickly evaluate a situation and whether it should be avoided or pursued. And pattern recognition works both ways. Similar to our sugar craving we mentioned at the beginning of the video, if we see something that we know is sweet, we are going to be motivated to get to it. And on the same token, we may be hesitant to get this honey because we know that while the honey is sweet, the bees are plentiful and they are stinging. In the modern day, pattern recognition is definitely not life or death, but it is an extremely important part of our everyday lives. And this ability to recognize patterns allows us to maintain a lot of free mental bandwidth, because if every time we approached a certain situation we had to reevaluate it from scratch, well, you would be thinking consistently. But if you have a kind of mental catalog of things you could quickly reference every time you see something you've seen before, your mind is able to streamline the process of thinking, which is something your brain's always trying to do. But here's the thing, even though pattern recognition in the modern day can and is extremely helpful in some cases, much like the others we've discussed that are helpful, they typically overstay their welcome and overstep and can be very detrimental. And how pattern recognition typically oversteps in the modern day is by causing us to misinterpret events without context, overthink situations that are not as deep as we think, or jump to conclusions that are not there. And the reason why we do all of these things is because our mind is consistently trying to understand things. So if we have a little bit of context around something, our brain is going to try as hard as possible to try to categorize the unknown with something we know, which is most often seen when people are generalizing things, whether it be about ideas or even people. Our brain wants to seek a pattern so it can reassure itself it knows what's going on here. In ancient times, if you saw an animal with pointy teeth, you didn't need any more context about it. But in modern times, you can see a person with tattoos and go, wow, this is a bad, scary person, I'm going to avoid them. When in reality, the fact that somebody may or may not have tattoos means absolutely nothing about their character and who this person may be. But our ancient brain that we possess wants to keep us safe and wants to generalize as much as possible, to quickly process information and to conserve as much energy as possible. And that wasn't a knock at people with tattoos. I have tattoos myself, they're just under my red shirt. But it's an old-timey stereotype that I thought would make sense. And by this point of the video, you've probably already begun to recognize some patterns yourself. One pattern is that all of the entries on this list are actually intertwined and typically work off of each other to help your brain do its best to understand things quickly and survive. But another pattern I want to suggest is that our brain is just doing the best it can. It's obvious that our brain has evolved to be as beneficial as possible, and our brain has done an extremely good job of developing an operating system that is optimized to keep us alive in the prehistoric world. However, while we have had a brain that has had hundreds and thousands of years to develop to a certain style of life, over the last few thousand years, our civilization has developed rapidly at a pace that our brain is simply not able to catch up to, which has landed us in the situation that we are in now. We are living in an extremely advanced society using powerful hardware that have a outdated operating system, and we're just trying to make it all work. But the bright side is this. While our brain still has instincts within it that are no longer helpful and sometimes hurtful to us, we still have the power and ability to overcome these ancient instincts. With awareness, focus, and intention, you can consciously make an effort to begin to personally reprogram your brain to be more suited to live in the modern day. And these are things that we've already began to do, whether it be consciously or unconsciously. And at the end of the day, our brain is our friend, and our instincts are trying their best to keep us alive. The world we live in is just a little bit different than what our brain is used to. So we've got to kind of update the software on our own, but that's kind of just part of the journey. So if you've been struggling with any of these things that I've talked about in this video, whether it be a craving for sugar, trying to fit in, feeling bad about other people being higher status than you, or craving control, realize that you're not broken and you're not wrong. You're simply experiencing the ancient programming that your brain has developed over hundreds of thousands of years of existence. But understand that this doesn't define you and that you can't the craziest internet trends people actually did. We've all been there. It's late at night, you're on your phone, and you're scrolling and scrolling until you see a video on your feed that just boggles your mind. It's a video of a person doing the dumbest thing you can imagine. Then you quickly scroll away feeling truly embarrassed for that individual. But as you continue to scroll, you realize that that individual wasn't the only person doing that dumb thing. And as you continue to scroll and scroll, you notice that more and more people are seemingly all doing this incredibly stupid task. You have just stumbled upon a dumb internet trend. Whether it was on TikTok or YouTube or Facebook, the moral of the story is the same. Someone does something really dumb, it gets a lot of likes and views because people are laughing at you, not with you, and people who are hungry for views and attention begin to do the exact same thing in hopes that they could also reach internet fame. I'm not gonna act like I'm a saint here. I remember being a kid and doing the Harlem Shake, hoping to go viral and be a part of cool Harlem Shake compilations. But today's video is not about the Harlem Shake. It is about internet trends that were very obviously dangerous and in some cases even deadly. Oh, and as always, this video is only going to get crazier as the list goes on. Let's begin. The Outlet Challenge. Admittedly, this is going to be the most tame thing I talk about in this entire video, which is crazy because this first entry is literally wild. I don't know about you, but I was definitely a curious kid. And one of the things I was quite curious about is what would happen if I stuck something in the electrical outlet. Fortunately, I never acted on this curiosity. However, I know a lot of people watching this video likely did. With that being said, I do think there is a bit of a difference between doing it accidentally or not knowing what's going to happen and doing it intentionally knowing exactly what's going to happen. Which brings me to the Outlet Challenge. Starting in the early 2020s, videos started circulating on TikTok specifically of people performing a prank where they would plug their phone charger into a wall, tight enough so it would hold, but loose enough so there was a gap, and then they would drop a penny into that gap to see what would happen. The outcome of the seemingly simple machine was, well, a homemade bomb. And that's not exaggeration. Nearly every video of people performing this challenge or trend resulted in a massive flash, typically resulting in an explosion and in some cases a fire. I wasn't able to track down the exact first instance of this challenge or trend taking place, but simply by searching Outlet Challenge, you can see that this trend was making waves specifically among schools in America. If you had nothing better to do, you could literally spend days watching TikToks of people at school plugging in phone chargers, dropping pennies, and causing explosions in the back of class, which unsurprisingly is dumb, but also dangerous. In the most tame examples of people performing this trend, the outcome would only be sparks and electrical shortage. However, in more extreme examples, full-blown electrical fires were started, smoke coming out of outlets, electrical outlets melting, and walls being covered in black tar, and classrooms needing to be evacuated. And I say classrooms specifically because nearly every video I watched about this challenge was once again at school. A place where kids felt like they could just, light off bombs and get away with it, I guess. Beyond the obvious stupidity of this challenge, there's truly not much more to say besides, I suppose, the danger or craziness aspect of it, which really isn't too crazy compared to some of the things we're going to discuss, but there is a very real opportunity for danger when performing this challenge, as a full-blown house fire is an extremely likely outcome if only a few sparks went in the wrong direction. Now, fortunately, that wasn't the case in most instances, but that doesn't mean that numerous students were at least suspended, expelled, or even charged for arson as a result of this completely dumb prank. Honestly, there's not too much more to say about it because it is extremely simple, and it's my opinion that the reason that this trend took off was because it was so easy to perform, and the result was a rather dramatic visual display. However, the ends don't justify the means here, because as I stated, intentionally shorting an electrical supply, specifically in a public place, is not only dangerous, but it's also illegal. And some kids that were dumb enough to try this challenge learned one or both of those lessons the hard way. Oh, and I guess as a little bit of a bonus for this first section, there was also a similar challenge going on around the same time that was known as the Chromebook Challenge. And all that this challenge involved was a school-provided Chromebook and a metal object. And how this challenge would be performed is you take your Chromebook, take your metal object, and put the metal object in the charge port of the Chromebook. And once again, similarly to to the outlet challenge, the results were dramatic and in some cases outright dangerous. Videos online of people participating in this challenge show devices begin to spark, smoke, or in some cases even catch on fire. And these fires have reportedly melted charge ports, burnt desks, and generally done enough damage to the Chromebook itself and school property to charge students with property destruction, or in some cases, similar to the outlet challenge, arson. So yeah, like I said, this is one of the more tame challenges we're going to discuss, but it's no less brain dead. Because sure, making a fireball with a penny may seem cool, and it's definitely funny to see on a TikTok, but the reality of the situation after your 2 seconds of fame on TikTok ends is a much darker reality I hope none of you have experienced. Let's move on. Door kicking challenge. In the first section, we talked about people intentionally doing damage to public property. However, in this section, the door kicking challenge turns it up a notch. Because in this very bright internet trend, what people do is intentionally damage private property, which not only comes with stricter repercussions, but also comes with a lot more danger, for reasons we'll get into. If you're watching this video and are a similar age to me, or probably any age, you likely at some point in your life have gone ding-dong ditching, or at least that's what we called it where I'm from. That pre-internet challenge consisted of going to somebody's house, knocking on the door, running away, hiding in a bush somewhere, and waiting for them to come outside for them to see, well, nobody at their door. And if you were extra crazy, you would do it once or twice more as well. And that was basically the extent of ding-dong ditching. Harmless, funny, but as an adult, I see how it is annoying. Although Ring cameras, I think, have more or less destroyed this entire hobby, which might be a good thing. Now, the door kick challenge differs a bit from ding-dong ditching, because in this internet trend, you're not simply knocking on somebody's front door. What you're doing is you're filming yourself donkey kicking someone's front door and running away. The major difference between these two activities, if you couldn't already tell, is that a donkey kick, A, does a lot more damage, B, is a lot more threatening to anybody inside the house, and C, filming yourself doing this only adds to the case going to be built against you once charges are inevitably laid. I honestly have no idea when knocking on the door became not enough and having to literally kick the door became the new standard for ding-dong ditching, but the fact that people not only upped the ante and also filmed themselves, to me is once again mind-boggling. However, when you're discussing internet or TikTok trends, you're not necessarily discussing the brightest bunch. And while this trend may seem extremely simple, the repercussions are definitely not. Because since this trend had gained popularity in the late 2010s and early 2020s, videos have of course gone viral online, and gullible children who partook in this challenge got in some serious hot water. As of today, several teenagers have already faced criminal charges for participating in this brainless prank. And some of the charges that have been placed on kids trying to be funny or go viral are the following: trespassing, vandalism, and even attempted burglary. Those charges alone are nothing to play with. But on top of the legal repercussions that kids have faced from doing this challenge, you also have to recognize the possible violent repercussions from homeowners. I'm not sure where you're watching this video from in the world, but I know there's at least a handful of you that are watching this that are saying, if this happened at my house, the first thing I'm doing is grabbing my gun. And because this trend was popular in the United States, that was the reality for a lot of homeowners. Now, part of this trend was after you kick the door, you leave. So fortunately, there wasn't many violent altercations taking place. However, if you were taking place in the door kicking challenge and happened to still be in the sightline of somebody who was armed and assuming that you were trying to break into their home, you may be leaving that property with more holes than you entered with. And I'm not saying that's necessarily right or wrong, but I'm saying that that's just a fact. If you go to somebody's property at night, donkey kick their door, in some case literally breaking the lock and opening it, I wouldn't say it's unfair for a homeowner to assume their house is being broken into. Just imagine how terrifying that can be. In my case, I actually can. Before I even knew this challenge was a thing, I literally had been more or less of the victim of this prank. I was at one of my friends' houses. We were having a big event for one of my friend's birthdays. The house was probably full with 20 people. And near the end of the night, we were all sitting in his living room when we heard a massive bang at the front door. It was late at night. This bang was not normal. It wasn't windy out, and we knew something was seriously wrong. Me and all my friends stood up. Instantly, we were terrified, but assumed a position. And the first thing we did was go and check out the front door. Fortunately, the door was locked. We unlock it, we open it, and nobody was there. But we noticed a massive footprint on the front door. My first thought was that somebody tried to kick down the door, failed, and ran off. But my friend who owned the home said that this was likely a kid trying to pull a prank and not to worry about it. And then he pulled up his Ring camera, saw the footage of the kid donkey kicking the door and running away, and well, we had a bit of a laugh about it, but we were all still rather irritated and on edge for the rest of the night. I think I've already given the door kicking challenge too much time as it is, because it is extremely simple and, well, I really don't need to explain how it's dumb and in some cases dangerous. But I will add a bit of a bonus as well, because similar to the door kicking challenge, there was also a similar trend that was going on, I feel like in 2023, 2024 known as the Kool-Aid Man Challenge. In this challenge, you would typically run through somebody's fence, usually late at night, usually while drunk, and the sole goal was to break a hole in the fence and then move on with your day. For this trend, I didn't find too many examples of people filming themselves doing it. However, there is so many examples on security footage of people walking typically drunkenly down the sidewalk at night, seeing a fence, and then just deciding to run through it and continue on with their stroll. Unsurprisingly, this challenge, like the door kicking challenge, has also resulted in numerous charges being laid on teens and young adults thinking they're funny and getting a serious reality check. The Tide Pod Challenge. If you hadn't have heard of any of the other trends in this video so far, you've definitely heard of this one. And some of you may be thinking, the Tide Pod Challenge, that wasn't real, that was a joke. People didn't actually do that. And well, you're technically kind of right. The Tide Pod food meme definitely started with a satirical nature. People were posting pictures on Twitter and Reddit and other social medias of food with Tide Pods as a topping. Ironic and innocent enough. However, this joke quickly grew from fantasy to reality. Specifically, when people decided that, sure, a picture of it on a pizza is silly, but what if I actually tried to eat it? And this thought process and the eventual videos that came out of this thought process led to an internet trend that, well, unfortunately swept the nation. The Tide Pod Challenge itself initially started circulating in the late 2010s, unsurprisingly among kids who had seen other viral videos and aspired to make their own viral videos, specifically of eating a Tide Pod. These videos weren't only exclusive to TikTok, they were kind of everywhere: Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. They were being shared everywhere because of how ridiculous they were, and the whole point of the video was to kind of just film yourself trying to eat a Tide Pod and getting a reaction. Your face of how you were trying to chew it, your face when you actually had the flavor and the, well, detergent in your mouth, and the rather disgusting aftermath of trying to get detergent out of your mouth and hopefully not out of your stomach. Similar to the whole outlet challenge, I feel like this challenge really took off because of how accessible it was to anybody. Like, if you're a kid in your mom's basement and you just happen to be scrolling TikTok and you saw somebody with 1 million likes eating a Tide Pod and spitting it out, well, all you would have to do is to go in the laundry room, get a Tide Pod, film yourself doing it, and boom, you're just as cool as that guy. And it's, in my opinion, because of this ease of access that this entire trend became as big as it eventually did. And while this challenge may seem simple and innocent enough, the outcomes were anything but that. Taking a step backwards, you kind of have to understand that the reason why the Tide Pod Challenge was even viral in the first place was because Tide Pods were so obviously inedible and, well, toxic. Like, there was a reason there was no Apple Challenge because, well, biting into an apple and eating it is, well, normal. But swap that apple for a toxic Tide Pod and now you have some content. Tide Pods themselves may be bright colored, smell good, and look like candy. However, they were the furthest thing from that. And even small amounts of exposure from the chemicals within Tide Pods could lead to chemical burns, seizures, difficulty breathing, and even severe poisoning in extreme cases. It's been reported that between 2016 and 2020, in the United States alone, there was over 35,000 emergency room visits of children under the age of 18 due to the Tide Pod Challenge. And in 12.5% of those 35,000 cases, hospitalization was required. And I feel like that just kind of goes to show the power of scale. Because yeah, sure, it may seem innocent enough to some that, oh, I just bit this inedible thing, I spit it out, I took the video, that's it. But when you have millions of people doing it, even if only 0.1% of people have an extreme unfortunate incident, well, that still leads to thousands upon thousands of people, as we saw, in the hospital because of Tide Pods. The Tide Pod epidemic itself got so bad, in fact, that in 2018, New York State introduced legislation that aimed to ban candy-style detergent pods to prevent further damages to children. I really wish that was a joke, but unfortunately, that's a fact. And it's crazy to believe that legislators literally had to try to come up with an idea on how to prevent children from eating Tide Pods. And I suppose there is an argument to be made about, well, the Tide Pods looking candy-like, I suppose. But the reality is, the challenge and trend itself were undoubtedly the reason that so many vulnerable and gullible children were partaking and, unfortunately, in some cases, hurting themselves. And while we don't know the true extent of how many people in total have tried to consume a Tide Pod, the fact alone that there was 35,000 hospital visits associated with Tide Pods is enough information to know that this challenge was truly detrimental of the bored youth of the late 2010s. The Fire Challenge. If I told you that there was a viral internet trend that consisted of simply setting yourself on fire, would you believe me? Obviously not, right? This is obviously the digital equivalent of saying, hey, if your friends jumped off a bridge, would you too? It's a rhetorical question that has an obvious answer. No. But what if I told you that the fire challenge was unfortunately a very real and very viral internet trend? And it was exactly as dumb as it sounded. The fire challenge is actually one of the older internet trends that we've discussed so far, and the mainstream popularity of this trend kind of emerged in the early 2010s. The videos of people participating in this challenge were simple. Put something flammable on your hand, typically rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer, light it on fire, look at the cool flames, and then put it out. Obviously dumb, but seemingly simple enough. However, as we've already seen, results and outcomes may vary. In the early 2010s, the challenge started small, people putting a little bit of rubbing alcohol in the palm of their hand to light it, and then put it out. And as these videos gained popularity, people kept raising the ante more and more. Instead of putting rubbing alcohol in the palm of their hand, they would cover their entire hand. Instead of covering their entire hand, they would cover their arm in it. And it even got to the point where people were putting rubbing alcohol on their entire body, lighting themselves on fire for a TikTok, and then attempting to put themselves out, sometimes unsuccessfully. It's my belief once again that this challenge truly took off because of the reasons we've discussed previously. Similar to the outlet challenge, it was visibly dramatic, and similar to the Tide Pod challenge, it was easily accessible. Any kid who was scrolling on Vine at the time or TikTok in the more modern times could watch somebody set themselves on fire and go, my mom has rubbing alcohol in the bathroom. She has a lighter beside her candle. I can do this right now and go viral. And unfortunately, that's what happened for a lot of kids. I'm sure at least some of you, and maybe even most of you, have seen videos online of people doing this challenge and unfortunately failing miserably, as there is a lot of viral videos of people partaking in this challenge and it just simply didn't go well. Fortunately, in most of these examples, these people at least had a quarter of a brain because they would perform this challenge in the shower. But even in those cases, it wasn't a foolproof plan, because I can remember from memory a video of a guy in a shower covered in rubbing alcohol, setting himself on fire, and before he could even put himself out, he falls, knocks over the alcohol, sets the entire bathroom on fire, and just leaves the bathroom before even turning the shower on. And while you don't see the aftermath of that video, I can only imagine it was detrimental. Most of the viral videos surrounding the fire challenge don't show the outcome, but some of the more unfortunate results include severe burns, infections from those burns, permanent scarring, and in some cases, even death. And reported deaths have happened because of this challenge. One of the more recent examples took place in 2023, when an Arizona teen named Corey Lee suffered burns on more than half of his body as a result of the fire challenge. Corey specifically was trying to do a variation of the fire challenge known as the fireball challenge, where you don't even set yourself on fire, you simply try to create a homemade fireball. I truly don't think I need to go into too much more detail on why it's not smart and obviously dangerous to literally set yourself on fire, but I did want to add more context around the whole fire challenge because, believe it or not, this was a pretty widespread trend, and it also has had resurgences over the last decade. And unfortunately, as we've seen, children are still dying in the 2020s due to the lack of education around these seemingly innocent but unfortunately deadly internet trends. The Milk Crate Challenge. This TikTok epidemic was likely the result of pandemic boredom. In case you've never heard of the Milk Crate Challenge, you don't have to eat a milk crate or you don't have to fit your body into a milk crate. The Milk Crate Challenge basically involves creating a sort of pyramid-based structure out of milk crates and then trying to cross it successfully. The challenge kind of blew up initially in 2021 on TikTok, and these viral videos showed people either successfully crossing super tall milk crate pyramids, or in most cases, getting about halfway up the pyramid only to then lose balance and have the entire milk crate pyramid fall over, and well, the video would end. These viral clips were funny to watch, seeming like just a regular fail video, somebody falling down, haha, whatever. But once again, with a desire for views comes upping the ante, and that's exactly what happened. The Milk Crate Challenge quickly grew bigger and bigger, with people building taller pyramids on more unsteady surfaces. And of course, with this increased danger in height, there was absolutely no increase in safety precautions, unfortunately leading to more virality, further feeding the beast. The Milk Crate Challenge, unlike some of the other challenges we've discussed, is a bit different because it's not necessarily only a feat of bravery, it's also a feat of physical endurance. To some, the Milk Crate Challenge was nearly an Olympic-level display of balance, speed, precision, and ultimately stupidity. Because it's no secret that milk crates are not the most sturdy structure, especially when you stack them 10 tall and stand on them while moving relatively quickly. And of course, the result of this extremely viral and, well, extremely dumb challenge was the following. Between 2020 and 2021 alone, there was over 8,100 emergency room visits as a direct result from this trend. And the most common injury associated with this trend was concussions, broken bones, and even paralysis in extreme cases. While at a first glance, the Milk Crate Challenge kind of just seems like a game show that you can build in your own backyard, you know, basically a mini redneck America's Ninja Warrior, absolutely nobody participating in this challenge got a prize. Unless you consider a concussion a prize, but I personally wouldn't. Interestingly, my whole philosophy of access doesn't necessarily apply here, at least not in my personal experience, because sure, it's easy enough to build build a milk crate pyramid, but who has like 20, 30, 40, 50 milk crates? Maybe that's just a Canadian thing because we put our milk in bags, but I personally have never experienced in my childhood or adult life an abundance of milk crates or desire to climb them in an unsafe manner. I feel like to some people it may seem controversial to put the milk crate challenge as more crazy than the fire challenge, but the reason why I did this was because the fire challenge was at least obviously dumb and you would truly have to be hungry for attention or a brain to try it for yourself. However, the milk crate challenge seemed a bit more innocent, and I would argue that it's for that reason it ultimately resulted in more injuries and death, which is why, in my opinion, it's likely more crazy. But speaking of crazy, it's crazy that nearly 75% of you are watching this video right now and are not subscribed. We just hit 1 million subscribers, we post fire videos every Friday, and we're now on the road to 2 million subscribers. If you like the videos I make, well, be a bro and subscribe. Now let's get to our next challenge. The blackout challenge. At this point in the video, you're probably thinking to yourself, if they made a challenge called the eat poop and jump off the roof challenge, people would do it. And you're probably not wrong. However, I did want to show a bit of sympathy for this next challenge because although it is relatively obviously dangerous, it's also one of the more innocent seeming challenges that has led to the unfortunate demise of so many innocent children. The blackout challenge or the choking game might be the oldest challenge on this entire video and actually predates the entire internet itself. I'm going to be focusing on the blackout challenge specifically, although the choking game has a similar goal, similar execution, and similar outcome. The entire point of the blackout challenge is to restrict oxygen flow to the brain, specifically to feel a state of euphoria and to also nearly lose consciousness without fully losing it. In the pre-internet times during the choking game, people would typically do this with their friends to experience the feeling of having that restricted oxygen flow to the brain. However, in more recent times, people would do this with their friends and film it to gain popularity online to show the reaction to essentially losing consciousness and literally losing brain cells. How the blackout challenge would typically work is one person would essentially take a deep breath in while another person would simultaneously give them a strong bear hug from behind until that person passed out from a lack of oxygen. Typically, as a result of this lack of oxygen, people would fall over and act drunk for a few moments before regaining consciousness. And these videos would go viral specifically among young people because of how crazy the effects were. Now, here's the deal. Some young people watching these videos just thought it was cool to see somebody act so weird and thought it was, almost like a morbid curiosity. However, some young people were very curious to have this experience for themselves, seeing it almost as a way to get high without doing drugs or alcohol. And this is a major dangerous factor in this entire challenge because young people seeing people do this online gave them a false sense of security that, oh, I'll feel funny or dizzy, but I'll be fine right after. And everybody online's doing it, so I can do it. When in reality, it's actually that false sense of confidence that provides so much risk. Not necessarily to one individual particularly, but because, once again, with scale, more people are trying it, there's more opportunities for things to go wrong. And go wrong, they did. You see, believe it or not, oxygen deprivation in the brain is extremely dangerous. And even brief interruptions of oxygen in your brain can cause seizure, long-term brain damage, heart complications, and even death in more ways than one. With the most common cause of death being asphyxiation, however, the second most common cause of death was actually head injury. That's because in some cases, people trying this challenge would lose consciousness and then fall and hit their head, in some cases either causing instant death or an injury that resulted in death not long after, which is just heartbreaking. The whole blackout challenge has claimed victims as young as 10 years old, and it's simply all because people saw it online, they thought it was safe, they thought it was a way that they could just feel silly for a few moments, when in reality, it's not that you just feel dizzy and silly, you are literally depriving your most important organ of its most important nutrient. And sure, the videos online may seem silly, but attempting to do this yourself is literally putting your life at risk. However, the target audience of this challenge was, for the most part, unaware of that fact. And the results, as we've discussed and seen, have truly been unfortunate. And that's kind of one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to make this video. A, to discuss some truly ludicrous and just outrageous trends that people have actually done, and also to try to hopefully spread some awareness. If you see people doing something online that seems dangerous or looks dumb, it probably is, and you probably shouldn't do it. Actually, you know what? I'm just gonna say, in basically no case should you do something you see people doing online. Not to be grandpa bro, but if we've learned anything from this video, it's that, well, internet challenges are not your friend. And I guess before we get to the last entry of this video, I just want to say, if you guys have enjoyed this video about crazy internet trends, unfortunately, there is many more that I could discuss, and I obviously couldn't fit them all in one video. So if you guys want a part 2 to this video, leave a like below, or just leave a comment saying part 2, and I would be more than happy to make that video for you. But with that being said, let's move on to the last entry of this video, the Kia Challenge. So far in this video, we've discussed challenges that are either destructive to others' property or your personal body. But this final entry on this list is a challenge that does both. The Kia Challenge started on TikTok in roughly 2022, and it was started by a group of teenagers who later became known as the Kia Boys. And the Kia Boys went viral because they were posting videos of themselves seemingly non-stop of them breaking into Kia and Hyundai vehicles using simple tools, starting them in under a minute, and then joyriding them in the most dangerous and dumb ways. I'm assuming most of you have seen or at least heard of the Kia Boys, but if you haven't, well, you're in for a treat. Like I mentioned, in the early 2020s, it was discovered that almost every Kia and Hyundai model had a major flaw. There was no engine immobilizer, meaning that if you had very basic tools and, well, very basic knowledge, you could break into these cars, start them, and you had a brand new car at your disposal. And with how popular Kia and Hyundai models have been in recent years, the Kia Boys and anybody wanting to try the Kia Challenge basically had instant access to the focal point of this challenge. Obviously, when these videos started popping up on TikTok around 2022, they were going extremely viral because of how insane they were. Kids were breaking into random Kias, starting them within a minute, joyriding them in the most dangerous of ways, typically speeding, hanging out the side of them, ramming into their vehicles, and then just ditching them and doing it all again. Sometimes numerous times in the same night. Obviously, I don't think I need to go into excruciating detail on why people with no license driving stolen cars at reckless speeds in neighborhoods is dangerous to literally everybody, but well, in case you're missing part of your brain yourself, the biggest dangers associated with this challenge are, of course, danger to roadgoers, danger to pedestrians, danger to the people that are in the cars, whether they be the burglar or people that are simply friends with the burglar that simply thought a joyride could be fun. And on top of the potential loss of life or injury that could be caused out of the stupidity, of course, we have property damage. Obviously, we have the individual that is likely just trying to get by who has just had their car damaged and stolen, but we also have all of the property damage caused by these joyrides that typically hit other vehicles, street signs, power poles, mailboxes, you name it, a Kia Boy, Kia car has hit it. And it seemed like in 2022, there was simply no stopping the Kia Boys, and these videos were viral. Not only videos from the Kia Boys themselves, but also videos of people trying it, news clips of the news covering the Kia Boys, and even interviews with the Kia Boys from different YouTubers. The whole Kia Boys trend and phenomenon became so popular that even TikTok got backlash for even hosting the content of these people doing it. And this trend was simply one of those trends that, while it's crazy to assume that somebody can be inspired to just steal a car by watching a video, because of how viral and prevalent this whole trend and phenomenon was, there was a massive spike of Grand Theft Autos during this time, which led to a plethora of viral videos, a plethora of injuries, a handful of deaths, and ultimately massive reform for automakers to ensure that this would never happen again. I think the overarching theme on this entire video is the fact that, sure, it may be interesting or shocking or even funny to see one of these videos online, somebody eating a Tide Pod or setting themselves on fire or falling off a milk crate. But what I really wanted to highlight in this video is that, sure, the 5 seconds you see may be shocking or funny or crazy, but the reality of that situation is much more dangerous than you could ever assume. Not only because the person you saw in that video might be permanently injured, but also because the video that you saw and thought was funny, somebody else saw and thought was inspiring. And well, their lack of education and misplaced inspiration could have led to serious bodily harm. How humans survived in every time period. This is you. The average, everyday, modern human being. Historically speaking, you are soft, squishy, and weak. And although you may not look like it, you are an apex predator, residing at the very top of the global food chain. But this has not always been the case. And this evolution of human dominance has taken hundreds of thousands of years to manifest. And where it's gotten us is you laying on the couch ordering Uber Eats without a care in the world. But the struggles that humanity has faced to get us to this very position is anything but pretty. And it's for this very reason that we are going to be investigating exactly how humans endured and survived every era of history, as well as seeing what it would take for a modern human to survive in previous time periods. Let's begin. The Stone Age. The first thing you're going to notice after being dropped in the Stone Age is the sheer shock of how little you truly have. In the Stone Age, you have no phone, wallet, glasses, watch, clothes. You are truly left to your own devices, and it's up to you to figure out how to survive. Luckily, not too far in the distance, you notice a small tribe of humans, and you know better than to interact with them, so you start by observing them. One of the first things you notice is how little these people have. This small tribe of humans have animal pelts draped over their body, and beyond that, appear to only have a pile of rocks and sticks at their disposal. The settlement that they're in is rudimentary and looks almost temporary. And that's because humans at this point in the early Stone Age are still primarily nomadic, meaning that long-term settlements aren't established yet. And although these people are occupying this area now, they likely won't be there in a few months, as they will likely seasonally follow animals in different weather patterns. Taking a closer look at this pile of sticks, you notice that they're not just sticks, they're actually tools. And these rocks that they're carrying all serve a purpose. Some of these longer sticks have pointed, jagged rocks at the ends, while some of the shorter sticks have large black rocks attached to them. And you notice that these are spears and obsidian axes. You notice one of these people actually creating these tools. They are literally using stones to carve out other stones. At this point, you're already taking a mental note of how simple the Stone Age appears to be in comparison to the modern day. And while that is definitely true, it's important to also note that just because something is simple, it does not mean that it's easy. Besides just sitting around and crafting stone tools that literally define this entire time period, there are a lot of other skills required to survive. One of the more unlikely culprits is actually social skills, which may seem a bit random, but when you think about it, your tribe in the Stone Age is literally your lifeline. Every aspect of life is so time-consuming and takes so much effort. Collecting food, cooking food, fabricating tools, preparing pelts, migrating. Literally everything takes so long. And it truly does take a village in the Stone Age just to support each other, because everybody plays their role. We are talking about real hunter-gatherer times. And it's for this reason that you need to provide value to the group that you live in. Because if you are in a group and you are unable to perform in any aspect of your tribe, there's a very likely chance that you're going to be exiled. If your gathering sessions are consistently unfruitful, and if you are simply not pulling your weight in the group, then the entire group is going to have to make the decision between picking up your slack or cutting off the weakest link and exiling you from the tribe. And during a time where every day is a struggle to survive, you do not even have the luxury of picking up anybody else's slack. And for the edgy lone wolves watching this video, being alone in the Stone Age may not seem like such a bad thing, until you realize that not only does every aspect of life require a group to truly thrive, but in this time period, you're also susceptible not only to nature, but natural predators. Because that's right, in the Stone Age, humans definitely have natural predators. And if one of these predators see a lone human walking around, they're either going to assume you're old, sick, exiled, lost, and it doesn't really matter which one is the case, because in any of those instances, you are vulnerable, meaning that a predator can easily make you lunch. With this new realization, you decide to introduce yourself to this group and make yourself at home, because the only way you as a modern person has any chance is by making some good friends. Fortunately, this tribe takes you in, but you are tasked with your first job, making fire. Another essential skill of Stone Age survival. As you gather a few sticks, you realize that the entire tribe is looking at you. And they didn't give you this task as a job, they gave it to you as a test. Because if you can't start a fire, then there is absolutely no way you can pull any weight, and they're better off leaving you behind. Although fortunately for you, you watched Survivor Man a time or two and spun a stick on a log like your life depended on it, getting a kindling going, and then a small fire, proving your worth to the group and ensuring your survival, at least for that day. As the day goes on, you are informed that it's now time to hunt. The tribe has sharpened tools, a new fire, and it's time to eat. And you're being invited to hunt with the tribe. With no other option, you accept the offer and you begin on the journey. One of the first things you realize is that while these people may be human, they are definitely not the same as you, because their endurance is next level. These hunters that you are struggling to keep up with can seemingly run for days. And not only that, they know exactly where they're going and they can read the landscape like the back of their hands. This deep connection to the landscape you inhabit is crucial for long-lasting survival in the wild. And as a modern human, it's a skill set you're going to have to develop. But for a Stone Age human, this is the only life you know, because you are still deeply connected and ingrained in nature. After a successful hunt, you return back to the camp exhausted, while the others you went out with seem barely phased at all. And that's because for you, this was the workout of a lifetime. But for these prehistoric people, this was simply everyday life. And this experience gave you a lot of context into how humans survived in the Stone Age. Survival wasn't a hobby or a job or entertainment. Survival was a daily task, day in and day out. And there was no work-life balance, because your life was work. And anything you needed, you had to work for. The clothes on your back, the food in your stomach, the wood in the fire, the stone on your spear, the cave that you're sleeping in. Everything required effort. And with that, we understand that Stone Age humans survived because of their deep understanding of the landscape that they inhabited. And these skills allowed them to consistently find places to live temporarily or even long term. And on top of their geographical knowledge, their ability to fashion tools out of materials simply laying on the ground is extremely impressive, and allowed them to not only catch animals and protect themselves, but also to create clothing and process food, and make other tools. And with that, if you could understand the landscape and develop your own tools, then the only other thing you really needed was the ability to create fire. And with that, you had every aspect of life essentially covered. Besides, obviously, shelter and water, but those are also part of understanding the landscape, because the water that you get comes from natural sources. And during the early Stone Age, most of the places you inhabit are also typically natural structures, or extremely simple structures made using natural materials. Because of this experience you've had with these Stone Age people, you've gained a newfound respect for prehistoric humans. And although you now have a better understanding of how cave people lived, you also are very certain that you want to spend no more time during the Stone Age, because you've been spoiled by the modern day, and the Stone Age is interesting, but it also makes camping look like a 5-star resort. And with that, we decide it's time to move on to the next time period. The Bronze Age. One of the first things you need to be aware of before we drop you into the Bronze Age is this. The Stone Age literally took place over the course of millions of years. But the Bronze Age is where we truly see the beginning of human technological development hit an exponential point. Because what humans are about to develop over the next couple thousand years is going to make the development over the millions of years in the Stone Age seem like child's play. Although it was obviously a necessary part of our human development. After being dropped in the Bronze Age, you almost don't recognize the world that you were looking at. Obviously, there are some glaring similarities between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, but the differences are stark. One of the first things you notice is that the people aren't wearing pelts anymore. They're wearing clothes. And now you feel underdressed because you're the only one wearing a loincloth. But beyond just the clothing that people are wearing, society looks completely different than it did in the Stone Age. In the Bronze Age, we see people begin to create settlements. And with that, we see agriculture, we see animal farming, we see settlements. And for the first time, we see two very important innovations. We see metal forging and we see the wheel. The collection and forging of metals is what obviously separates the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. And while upgrading from obsidian tools to copper swords is definitely an improvement and ensures that tools are able to last a lot longer, it isn't the only notable change by far. Having tools made in a new material is cool, but having a new material that allows the door to open for expertise to flourish and for unique tools to exist definitely opened up the floodgates for more innovation. With metal forging existing, we now have a method for creative people to develop and hone in their skills. And instead of relying on using a dull rock to sharpen a sharp rock, we now have the opportunity to create nearly anything we can imagine, at least for the time. And with that, the simple introduction of this new metal alone, society begins to evolve. Because now we have artisans and experts, and then we have early jobs and an early economy based off of these new items and metals. And things are already developing at a pace quicker than I can describe. But besides just having new metals and new jobs because of it, we also have the wheel. And the wheel was crucial for literally mobilizing society. Not only did we see civilization establish settlements in the Bronze Age, but we also saw settlements become connected because of the wheel. And these settlements became connected through trade routes and war. Two things that also went on to further evolve society. However, even with all of these revolutionary technological developments, the Bronze Age to a modern human still seems like an extremely slow and barbaric way of life. And for that reason, you need to learn exactly how to acclimate to this time period. Fortunately, the development you found yourself near has almost everything a human could need. And one of the first things you do is get yourself some new drip, because that loincloth had the ladies and the men looking at you the wrong way. Walking through this village, you understand that community is still extremely important. However, this stage of the game, by game I mean history, is a lot less grindy. Instead of spending all day looking for berries, you are simply picking the berries in the garden. Instead of spending the entire day looking for a goat, you are simply taking one from the farm. And instead of feeling like you have to do everything all the time, for the first time you feel like you actually have the opportunity to specialize and focus on something. And although things are definitely looking a lot better than they did in the Stone Age, in the Bronze Age, you still need to make sure that you're carrying your own weight. Because at the end of the day, you need to put a roof over your head and food in your stomach today. And what that means is you once again need to provide value. And while the value you provide in the Bronze Age looks different than the Stone Age, the general concept still applies. There are no free lunches, and if you want to survive, you need to do something. Although in the Bronze Age, there are more opportunities. Since your goal is survival, you decide that joining any sort of army is not for you, and you're also not interested in any form of combat sport involving a copper sword. You briefly ponder potentially becoming a criminal, because then anything you want is free. Although, after seeing how basically every crime can be punishable by death during this period of time, you realize that a modest job may be your best way of surviving. Even though there's a lot more technology in the Bronze Age, the components required for life are still the same. You need food, water, and shelter. And the one job that you identify that can provide you all of this is farming. Because of the new tools and methods introduced in the Bronze Age, mass farming is at an all-time high, at least relatively. And for that reason, there's a lot of opportunity to work within farming. And a lot of these jobs provide food, shelter, and water in return for your all-day, indefinite, back-breaking labor. It's not glamorous, but your goal here is survival. You're not trying to be rich or famous, you simply just want to live a long, safe life. But after making yourself useful on the farm and breaking your back, even though you now have new tools, a wheel, and new clothes, you decide it's time to continue moving. Because although the Bronze Age and Stone Age feel like night and day in human history, you know that there's a lot more to come and you want to experience it. The Iron Age. The difference between Bronze Age and Iron Age is not nearly as shocking as the difference between Stone Age and Bronze Age. However, it doesn't mean that the advancements are any less important. During the Iron Age, we don't necessarily see an entirely new way of life, although we see an expansion upon the previously established way of life in the Bronze Age, with some improvements. Obviously, the most notable difference being the new metal at play. Iron changed the metal tool game like never before, and that's because it was readily available and extremely durable. And because of that, iron tools became economical, and what that means is not only was there some tools, there was a lot of tools. And with more tools being in the hands of more people, human development began to ramp up even quicker than before. And because of this, we start to see society truly hit scale. Farming, both agriculture and livestock, became more optimized. Iron mining became more optimized. Metal forging became more optimized, and there was more of it. And because of this, everything that the Bronze Age really established, the Iron Age was able to run with. And that's kind of a common theme in every time period so far. Every lesson, development, technique developed in the previous time period can be applied and expanded upon in the next one. And that's kind of life in general, if you think about it. Regardless, with yourself being dropped in the Iron Age, my advice to you on surviving wouldn't be much different from the Bronze Age. Make sure you are refining your social skills to have a good circle of people around you, and make sure that you are obeying the law, make sure you're not getting yourself into any wars, and make sure that you're making yourself valuable without making yourself a target. Since you already have experience from farming in the Bronze Age, I would recommend farming once again in the Iron Age. You could make a living, afford shelter, afford food, be around water, and if everything took a nasty turn, you would at least have the skill set to provide for yourself if all else fails. And might I add, in this time period, to take up some sort of sword fighting hobby in the background. Not because you want to fight in a war, but because you want to be able to protect yourself in any situation. And like they say, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. The medieval era. One of the first things you notice after landing yourself specifically in medieval England is the difference in people. There's civilizations like you saw in the Iron Age, although this civilization is different. It's obviously more developed, but one of the biggest things you notice is the sheer amount of class separation. Most of the people you see roaming the streets don't look super different than they did in the Iron Age. Although you do see almost a new class of people. You see merchants with elaborate clothing. You see nobility with clean robes, and you even get a glimpse of the king going down the street. And it's with this initial impression that you realize that you're not in Kansas anymore. Besides the differences that you see, there's a big difference that you can smell. Because being smack dab in the middle of medieval England, you can smell everybody and everything. And that's because with how developed cities have become, people are being more and more crammed into smaller and smaller places. And for that reason, everybody is literally in everybody else's business. And if you thought working on a farm in the Iron Age smelled bad, well, just smell medieval England. And make sure you keep your mouth closed if you see anybody on the second floor dropping fudge popsicles out of a bucket from their window. After noticing this rather large wealth gap, you understand that if you want to survive, your best chance is by at least having a bit of money. Because the vast majority of poor serfs, unless they are skilled laborers that are able to stay in town, are typically sent to the countryside for agricultural jobs. And while that was something you have experience in, you don't want to slave your life away anymore. And the life of a serf in medieval times is typically not one that screams longevity. Long hours, poor food, poor healthcare, no education, unsafe work conditions. There's a lot that could go wrong. And for that reason, with your goal of surviving, you want to have at least a few shillings in your pocket. You end up cozying up to a local sword merchant. And while this is a suitable side gig and you're able to learn the business and grow within the company, you realize that this society is a lot more complex than previous times. Obviously, royalty is relatively new in your historical travels, but on top of this, religion is a massive staple, not only in day-to-day life, but also in your survival. In medieval England, the Roman Catholic Church ruled over everything. And for that reason, if you were not following the rules of the church, you could be fined. And if you publicly disobeyed or potentially disagreed with the church, you could be killed. Which is why you quickly begin to study the Bible and learn a few prayers in Latin. After getting your side gig and getting familiar with the local customs, you are now met once again with the harsh reality of sickness. While human development has brought us new major cities, we are now experiencing the downfall of some of these overcramped and unsanitary cities, specifically plagues. And if you just happen to be living through 1348, your best chance of survival would be leaving the city immediately and taking the skills you learned in the Stone and Bronze and Iron Age to live off the land yourself. Because during the plague, even buying bread from somebody could be a death sentence. But outside of these relatively niche plague times, there is still the overarching lack of healthcare. Obviously, there was basically none in any of the previous time periods, but in the medieval era specifically, there was at least development with healthcare, but a lot of these treatments were actually more harm than good, meaning that if literally anything went wrong, whether it be a broken bone or a small cut, if you weren't in perfectly good shape and perfectly healthy, you were much closer to death than you would have ever been in the modern day. But even if you were lucky enough to be surviving in the medieval era during a time when there was no plague, you had a job that was making you not a poor serf, you still had to hope to God, literally, that there was not a war on the horizon. Because if you, as a young adult, were summoned to war, you essentially had no option. Either go to war or be killed for not going to war. And if you went to war and got injured, your chances of dying were high. And if you went to war and got injured and survived, once you came home, you would not be able to continue your work and you would essentially be poor on the street and likely die on that street. And with that hard lesson learned, you realize that if you want to survive in medieval times, you need to not only work a job, but be savvy enough to earn a higher than normal income. You have to religiously follow the church. You must never break a law. You must never upset a royal. You must never be in bad health or become injured. You must hope that a war never breaks out that requires your assistance. And spoiler alert, there was a lot of wars during the Middle Ages. And while you actually find the Middle Ages rather interesting, you know that this was not the place for you. And you decide to continue your journey. The early modern era. The early modern era is the shortest time period we're going to discuss on this list, besides the modern era, which is still ongoing. The early modern era was only 300 years long, spanning from 1500 to 1800 AD. But this time period was pivotal for human civilization. And while it consists of a lot of the things we've already discussed previously, the early modern era specifically is defined not by metals, but by intellectual pursuits, specifically in major developments in both world exploration and scientific pursuits. With the prosperity that Europe saw during the Middle Ages, they decided that their best next course of action during the early modern era was to begin expanding, which is why we saw a plethora of colonization during this time, because these European countries wanted more land, more wealth, more power. And because of this, the early part of the early modern era is rather tumultuous. There is a lot of religious instability, and also instability across the globe with this newfound colonization. And because literally so many revolutions took place during the early modern era, if you have to be a part of one of the revolutions, I would recommend being a part of the scientific revolution, specifically by trying to get your name in the same group as Copernicus, Galileo, or Newton. And while you might be thinking, I'm not nearly as smart as any of those guys, you don't need to be. Because if you're a modern person just being dropped in the early modern era, then you have a plethora of knowledge that you could use to change the world early and make yourself not only a remembered scientist, but also literally a god. But also keep in mind that revealing too much knowledge would actually not get you respected, it would get you killed, because you would just seem crazy. And if you challenge the status quo too much, well, that wouldn't be good for you. So with your goal of survival, you drop hints about knowing things and become a respected philosopher, making sure that you stay vague, but also inspirational. Near the end of the early modern era, you begin to see things that you recognize from the modern era. You see democracy, capitalism, banking, personal individuality, and this is all a part of the Enlightenment near the end of the early modern era. And it's with this realization that you remember that you're almost home. You've been going through almost all of human history, and now your final step is going back to the modern day. And while your time in every different time period has been brutal and tough, and you've missed even the most modern of luxuries like Uber Eats and a toilet, you've definitely grown to respect previous eras of history. And you've had a major boost in respect for people who came before you, and essentially paved the way for you to live the comfortable life you live today. And with that, you realize that there's only one more place to go, and that's returning home, the modern era. Obviously, if you want to know how to live in the modern era, go look in the mirror or ask your grandpa. But I want to point out some interesting nuances that separated the early modern era from the modern era, because the modern era isn't just this week or this month. It dates back all the way to the early 1800s. And even though it was less than 200 years ago, the early 1800s is a much different time and lifestyle than the 2020s. One of the biggest technological advancements during the modern era is the Industrial Revolution, which swept through Europe, America, and eventually the world, and changed not only jobs and economies, but lives forever. But the Industrial Revolution wasn't just the building of factories and a boost in manufacturing jobs. It also meant further development in urban areas, specifically with developments in mining and transportation, with trains, buggies, and eventually cars becoming popular. And these tools, once again, changed the world and allowed further and further exponential development. And while this Industrial Revolution definitely improved the quality of life of some, there is undoubtedly still horrible labor conditions existing for those working in factories. And this includes women and children being paid next to nothing for backbreaking and then sometimes deadly jobs. But it's once again these hardships that people go through that brings us to the modern day, 2025. Now, this is not to say that the modern day is perfect, because it's not by any means. And this also isn't to say that every hardship in the past has been justified because it led us to today. Although, what I am trying to say is that the world we live in today is a work in progress and has been developed developed by hundreds of thousands of years of human development, driven by the urge to do better and never give up. Humans have always endured, persevered, and grew. And if you look at the timeline of humanity, that is a fact. So, although in the modern day we may have our own issues and be squishier than we used to be, we are still actively participating in this ongoing pursuit of human development, and humans, at the end of the day, are badasses. While there's definitely issues in the modern day, life has never been more comfortable and convenient and easier to at least stay alive in. The most haunted locations from around the world. I've touched on a lot of creepy things so far in this channel. Serial killers, mythical creatures, folklore, SCPs, but I've never discussed ghosts directly. But today, that changes. And I'm gonna answer all your questions about these haunted locations. Like, how did it become haunted? What ghostly encounters have been recorded? And are these places even really haunted? The year is 1835. And you have just been invited to a beautiful Christmas get-together at one of your friends' manors in the English countryside. The manor was just absolutely beautiful, and this party was packed with notable people. Respected colonels, wealthy businessmen, and high-ranking government officials. The night consisted of seemingly endless food and drinks and music, and everything was just so perfect. Late into the night, once the party started to die down, you and a group of friends decided that it was time to go to bed, and you all went your own separate ways to get to your bedrooms. You turn down a hallway and you're finally by yourself and only steps away from your bedroom. When you notice down this hallway there's this woman, a woman that was wearing only brown clothing. You didn't recognize this woman from the party, but this isn't your house, and you didn't know everybody at this party, so you figured it was somebody else also going to their room. This woman was slightly notable due to the apparel that she was wearing, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and you continued to your room and had a good night's rest. You woke up the following morning on Christmas Eve and engaged in the morning festivities. The party was still not done. There was a huge brunch being served, and you and everybody else were not going to miss it. You sit down at a table with some of your friends, one of which being a colonel, and he mentions that last night he saw a rather peculiar woman. Another person at your table asks, what did she look like? And the colonel goes on to explain that on his way to his bedroom, he saw a woman dressed exclusively in brown robes. These robes were dated and tattered and had to have been at least from the previous century. It didn't look right at all. And the colonel was concerned because this woman might have been somebody who either snuck into the manor or was somebody who was obviously lost. But the colonel mentioned once he spotted this woman and walked closer to her and then tried approaching her, he realized this woman had turned around and he got a look at her face. And that's when he claimed that he saw this woman's bright white face with empty eye sockets, and the man was terrified. He didn't scream or run away, but he quickly made his way to his room without asking any more questions. Instantly, your heart dropped to your stomach because you also saw the same woman, but you didn't see her face. And before you could say anything, another woman at the table says, I also saw a lady dressed up in brown. I didn't see her face, but she was standing in the hallway, not saying anything and not moving. And your heart and stomach only sank deeper. You noticed that the host of the party was sitting beside you, and her face was in shock. You asked her, who is this lady wearing these brown rags? And she confessed that she had absolutely no idea. The Christmas party was a formal event and everybody was dressed in their absolute best. Nobody was wearing brown, and there was nobody in the party with sunken in, missing eyeballs. The host of this party quickly stands up on her chair and started clinking a spoon on her glass, causing the conversation in the room to a silence. And the host of the party asked, did anybody see a woman in brown robes anywhere in the manor last night? And to her dismay, numerous people in this room of nearly 100 people raised their hand. The story I just told is based on a real documented encounter that happened in 1835 at a Christmas party. And this story is significant because it is the first recorded sighting of the ghost that is now known as the Brown Lady at the iconic Raynham Hall. And this isn't the only sighting that's taken place, and it's probably not even the most iconic either. And only days after this event, when the host of the party made the staff aware of all of these claims, people literally quit their jobs and never returned out of fear of encountering this strange apparition. But that's not it. There was a handful of sightings on that night in 1835, but the following year in 1836, Captain Franklin Marryat, who is actually a friend of Charles Dickens, heard tell of the legend of this brown lady in the Raynham Manor and spoke to the owner directly and requested that he stay in the most haunted room of them all so he could prove that there was no ghost at all and that this legend simply came to be because the owner of this manor wanted to keep people away from his property. And let's just say he got more than he bargained for. This captain checked into the hotel and stayed in a room that literally had a painting of the apparition hung in the room. Like I mentioned, at this point, the Brown Lady was already a local legend and a common sighting within the hotel. And for the first 2 nights of his visit, the captain had a normal experience. He was staying in a hotel and rather comically was sleeping with a loaded revolver revolver under his pillow just in case. And it was after the second night and the beginning of the third night when everything began to change. Because on night 3, Frederick didn't get a good night's sleep at all. What he did get was a run-in with the brown lady. Frederick had just gotten into bed and was ready to go to sleep when he noticed something in front of his door. The door never opened, but there was obviously a shadow of some sort in front of the door blocking the path. The shadow was moving and getting bigger until Frederick realized that this shadow was exactly what he was looking for. He quickly looked at the painting on the wall and noticed that this was the brown lady, and she was in his room and she was getting closer to him. Frederick grabs the revolver from under his pillow, points it at the apparition, and screams at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Don't come closer! I'm going to shoot!" But the brown lady grew a menacing grin and began to get closer, practically at the foot of his bed, when Frederick pulled the trigger, shot the revolver into the darkness, and the apparition disappeared. 3 hotel workers came into the room to ask what had just happened, and Frederick left the hotel and never returned. I tried to only tell one story per section, but I figured that story was kind of worth going into detail over. Over the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a plethora of other run-ins with the brown lady, which brings us to Captain Hubert C. Provant, who not only had a run-in with the brown lady, but was able to capture a picture of her, a full-body apparition. And this photo is not only iconic to the Raynham Hall, but it's also one of the most iconic photos in all of ghost hunting. This photo was taken in 1936, and since this photo has been taken, sightings have been few and far between, although many people still believe to this day that Raynham Hall is haunted. Once again, just a crazy story, but you might be thinking, okay, sure, there's this ghost there, but who is this lady and how did she get there? And because this section's getting long, let me boil it down. According to the legend of the brown lady, the Townsend family, which was the family that owned the Raynham Manor, after numerous run-ins with this apparition, was able to identify her from one of the paintings that was displayed within the manor. The woman was named Dorothy Walpole, who lived from 1686 to 1726, and was the sister of Robert Walpole, who is considered the first ever Prime Minister of Great Britain. She was the second wife of Charles Townshend, one of the original Townsends that owned the manor, and this man was well known for having a short temper. Allegedly, this man had caught Dorothy with another man, a lord, and as punishment, he locked her in her room in the manor, and she was never allowed to leave. She wasn't allowed to see friends, family, or even her own children. She was a prisoner in her own home until 1926 when she passed away from smallpox. Obviously, that story is upsetting both ways, because if Dorothy did cheat, then that's awful. But Charles had absolutely no right to do any of that whatsoever. If somebody cheats on you, you just break up with them. You say, hey, you get out of my manor, we're done. You don't say, hey, I'm gonna trap you in this room until you die. To this day, Raynham Hall is one of the most iconic haunted locations in all of England. But this is one of the more tame entries on the list, and we're only just getting started. It's the mid-1800s, and you are a medical doctor, Dr. Charles Finney. You live in Atchison, Kansas, and you run a successful medical operation out of your home. This home was something your family recently commissioned, and now you were both living in it and making it your place of business, at least for now. And everything was going smoothly until one night. You were in bed, exhausted after a long day, with your eyes feeling like they're each 1,000 pounds, just begging to be closed. And as you're on the verge of sleep, about to drift off, you hear a knocking at your door. This was extremely uncommon. You obviously had no appointments in the dead of night, and you had no idea who this could be. Reluctantly, you get out of bed and head to your front door. And when you open the door, you notice a woman standing there, holding her young daughter. This woman is frantic and explains that her daughter is in severe pain, and she can't walk, can't move, and she is in endless, excruciating pain coming from her abdomen. The doctor's fatigue instantly wears off, and he's back in work mode. And he invites the woman and the daughter in, and quickly takes them to his basement examination room, where he's able to identify the likely source of all of this pain, an inflamed appendix that was about to burst. The doctor informed the mother that this young girl needed emergency surgery now, and the mother agreed, saying, please, anything to save my daughter. The doctor quickly prepped the location, washed his hands, grabbed his tools, and then began to administer the anesthesia. Once everything was ready and the medicine was administered, the doctor hastily made the first incision. Although little did he know, the anesthesia that he had administered was an improper dose, and this girl, who was already in pain, was now in even more pain, as she could feel everything. And this incision that the doctor had just made was the final straw. Her body went into shock, and not long after, she passed away on that operating table. That young girl's name was Sally, and this story is the reason why this location is known as the Sally House. First thing I'm gonna say right off the bat is, as interesting as that story is, there is absolutely no recorded evidence for that story actually being true. And it's largely regarded as a folktale, loosely based in reality. Dr. Charles Finney was a real doctor, and he worked in Atchison, Kansas. And he lived out of his practice that his family had recently commissioned. That all is true. But as far as the story of Sally is concerned, there was no physical evidence. But the reason I mention the story is because it is the story that is most associated with this haunted location. And this haunted location is one of the most iconic in all of the United States of America. So yeah, I wanted to make that distinction primarily because I knew if I didn't, others would say, that's not actually true. And well, it's not proven either way, but it is highly debated and not proven that it did happen. So I'll let you make up your mind on that. That story is upsetting and sad, but what does it have to do with haunted locations? Well, that story is kind of where everything began. Because after this incident that may or may not have happened in the late 1800s, experiences in the Sally house have been vast and plentiful. Some experiences only consist of hearing a creak or faint footsteps, or even the giggle of a young girl. But other encounters are a lot more sinister, with items being thrown, loud screams being heard, and even visitors being scratched to the point of bleeding. Nearly every former tenant or owner of the Sally house that had been interviewed alleged to have experienced paranormal activity of some sort, typically with consistent attributes across all of the accounts, with some even claiming to see Sally in the window at night when it was known that nobody was home. If you're watching this video, you're probably into the paranormal, which means you've probably seen some of your favorite ghost YouTubers stay in this house. Sam and Colby, Nick and Ryan, Exploring with Josh, or even large-scale TV productions. All of these people have stayed in the Sally house and had unique experiences. So for that reason, I'm not going to go too much more into detail. But I will say this, the Sally house hasn't been anybody's personal residence since the 1990s, and in more recent times has been a popular tourist attraction, which kind of makes you think, is the legend of the Sally house real? Or do people just want to keep the story alive because there's a financial incentive? Regardless, the Sally house is regarded as one of the most iconic haunted locations in the United States. The year is 1885. You and your wife are pioneers in New South Wales, Australia, and you have just finished building a double-story late Victorian-style manor on the top of a hill overlooking your local town. This was you and your wife's dream homestead, and you built it with your very own hands. The construction was a labor of love, and now you could enjoy this manor for the rest of your life. This manor became known as the Monte Cristo homestead, and you and your wife enjoyed it up until your deaths. After you and your wife were long gone and your family had no longer lived in the residence, the house essentially was left abandoned. There were caretakers, but unfortunately, the Monte Cristo homestead fell into disrepair. That was until it was purchased by another couple, Reg and Olive Ryan, and they were dedicated to building this beautiful manor back to its former glory, and that's exactly what they did. They took it from a derelict, abandoned home to something that was actually habitable. And once again, the homestead was a home again. And it wasn't long after Reg and Olive moved in that things began to get weird. One late night, only a few days after the Ryans had officially moved in, they were heading home after an event, when they noticed that as they approached their house, they could see bright lights beaming from inside the house, illuminating all of the windows. This caught Reg and Olive's attention, and they were both speechless at what they were looking at. Reg knew that the electricity wasn't even fully finished in the house yet, and for the places that did have electricity, he knew he left no lights on and no lamps burning. Olive was just in sheer terror, and the couple stopped halfway up their driveway in pure awe of what they were looking at. Their home illuminated in the middle of the night for no reason at all. Terrified, the couple approached the house, and the closer they got, the dimmer the lights got. And by the time they actually reached their new home, the house wasn't illuminated at all, and it was as dark as it should have been. The couple theorized that maybe they were just seeing the reflections of the headlight of their vehicle, but deep down they knew that wasn't what they saw at all. And this was only the beginning of the strange encounters that were going to take place over the next few years. Following this event, when the family decided to bring their family cat to their new home, instantly the cat was uncomfortable, which is common. This cat's in a new environment and was just in a car ride, something it didn't enjoy. But as soon as your wife put the cat on the floor, it arched its back and moaned in fear as if it was face to face with another cat. There was nothing there. The cat hissed and screamed and immediately ran out of the house. You, your wife, and your 3 daughters looked for the cat and never found your cat again. Following that event, there was numerous occasions where your daughters claimed that they could see a man's face out the window, which was impossible considering that all of your daughters had bedrooms on the second floor, and there was never any unknown men near or around the property. The family frequently encountered disembodied voices and footsteps and noises, doors opening and drawers closing, and there was truly no explanation for any of it. After years of alleged strange and ghostly encounters, the homestead was converted into a museum, where it showcased antiques, local treasures, and became a tourist attraction with a gift shop, and became known as Australia's most haunted house. Since then, it was featured in numerous TV shows in the 70s, 90s, and early 2000s and 2010s. But very recently, in January of 2025, the homestead was actually closed to the public as Olive Ryan passed away. The Monte Cristo homestead is likely one of the most famous haunted houses in all of Australia. And whether or not the paranormal experiences actually happened to Reg and Olive, or if they just made up stories to have a way to make money off of the house they just restored, I'll let you decide. The year is 1907, and the Dutch have just finished building a beautiful office building for their railway developments in Indonesia. Why the Dutch had a rail company and headquarters in Indonesia is a different conversation. But regardless, this building existed, and it looks really cool, and operated until 1942. That's because the Japanese invaded Indonesia, and they wanted everything, including this beautiful office building. You might be asking yourself, did the Japanese just use it as their office building? Now it's their headquarters in Indonesia? And the answer is no, because once they had total control of this building, they turned an entire wing of the building into a dungeon, specifically for torture and executions, something that wasn't uncommon for the Japanese in World War II. From 1942 until 1945, the building was under Japanese control, until Dutch forces tried to overtake the building from the Japanese. And in October of 1945, a battle took place within the building from Dutch troops who entered through a tunnel underground. Although the Dutch weren't only fighting the Japanese, they were also fighting the Indonesians. And the battle lasted 3 days, and the Dutch eventually retreated. Once World War II ended, the Indonesian army took control of the complex, and it was restored and given back to the Indonesian Railway Company, not the Dutch Railway Company. And in 1992, it was officially considered cultural property of Indonesia. From 1992 until 2009, this building was essentially left to rot, and over this time, it was vandalized, and nature had began to take it back, with mold growing, parts of the building collapsing and falling apart, and locals beginning to have interesting stories regarding this building. This building, with quite the history, is known as Lawang Sewu, and it is considered one of the most haunted locations in all of Indonesia. Lawang Sewu is very interesting, and its history alone is something to be researched and talked about. During the time that this building was left in disarray, many local teenagers would make it a challenge to touch the building, or go near the building, or go inside the building, or even in extreme cases, stay overnight in the building. This massive building with such a dark and long history became a bit of an icon for all the wrong reasons, and everyone essentially considered it to be an evil, haunted building with dark energy and dark spirits associated with it, which kind of makes sense. Like, just imagine how dark the energy is being in a building, knowing the history. The unspeakable things that happened in this building, I could only imagine left some sort of energetic residue. Regardless, this building became very popular with thrill seekers in Indonesia. And it was over this near 20-year stretch when this building was falling apart that people had many strange encounters within the walls. Hearing voices, hearing footsteps, seeing apparitions, being scratched, being touched. All of these took place within the walls. The Indonesian government actually had plans of restoring this building, but were hesitant to do so because they feared that nobody would use or interact with the building because of the fear associated with it being haunted. But against their better judgment, they continued with the restoration project. And from 2009 to 2011, the building was restored. And in 2013, the building was officially open for tours. And currently, it's a massive hit for tourism in the region of Java, Indonesia, and sees over 1,000 visitors every single day. Now, here's the thing that's kind of interesting about this building. The government has official plans to, quote, eliminate the spooky image in order to attract more visitors, which I think is interesting because that's kind of the opposite of what most ghost house owners want, right? Like, they want to not only maintain but amplify the spooky image in order to bring in people. But I guess the difference is they are wanting to make this a historical landmark, but they are fearing that this image could scare people away, as especially in this region of the world, people are extremely superstitious when it comes to spirits. And there are plenty of locals that avoid this building entirely, as they fear that going near or around this building could lead a spirit to follow you to your home and essentially bring you bad luck and negative energy. So yeah, Lawang Sewu over the last 120 years has had a very long and interesting and unfortunate history, including colonization, war, torture, executions, and other unspeakable things, I'm sure. But as the government allowed this building to sit and rot, the locals decided to have some fun and found a little bit more than fun. And today, the government has restored this building to make it a historical landmark and are doing their best to make sure that nobody talks about the whole ghost part of this building, which is kind of funny. Definitely one of the more obscure entries in this list. Before we get to the last entry on this list, I just wanted to make a quick point. Originally, this video was supposed to have 10 entries, not 5. But because it takes so long to animate the stories associated with each of these sections, I decided to just essentially cut it in half. I didn't want to sacrifice the storytelling or the information for the sake of having more entries on the list. I say this because there is a ton of other crazy, obscure haunted locations that I want to talk about. So consider this video a part 1, and if you guys want that second part, leave a like or leave a comment and I will post another video about the craziest and most obscure haunted locations from around the world. Now, back to the final entry of this list. The year is 1776. You are a healthy adult man living in Venice, Italy. You have a beautiful wife and a newborn son, and unfortunately you are experiencing the harsh wrath of the plague. It's killed numerous friends and family members of yours, but fortunately you, your wife, and your son are safe. For now at least, because you have to work every single day to be able to afford to live. Your family depends on you, and you try to be as safe as possible. That is, until you catch the plague. At this point in time, the government had a protocol for anybody who had caught the plague. And your fate was to be sent to the island of Poveglia, an island that at this point the Italian government was using solely as a quarantine station for those with the plague and other diseases. And that is where you went. You weren't able to say goodbye to your wife or son as it would pose too much risk to them, and you felt confident that if you went to this island, you would quarantine and come back a healthy man and return to your family. But unfortunately, almost as soon as you were shipped to this island, you were never heard from again. Your son was able to grow up through the plague and survive it. As time went on, the plague began to go away. Things began to change. One of the bigger changes that happened was the Italian government was no longer using Poveglia as a quarantine station, but as a remote mental institution. And unfortunately, your son, through the trauma that he experienced growing up in the plague, losing his father, and other hardships that he had in his life, found himself also on the island of Poveglia. This time, not because of the plague, but because of a mental disorder that was at the time not understood. The island of Poveglia at this point had claimed the lives of multiple generations in your family. But sadly, this wasn't unique to your family. Tens of thousands of people had perished on Poveglia Island. And it's because of that dark and death-filled history that Poveglia Island is regarded as not only one of the most haunted locations in Italy, but one of the most haunted locations in the entire world. From the late 1300s until the late 1900s, this small island was inhabited by people and used for multiple different reasons. The two primary reasons, the quarantine station and the mental asylum. There was likely an unspeakable amount of atrocities that took place on this island, and it's for that reason that after it was abandoned, people gained quite the interest in visiting it. The mental hospital was the last official use of this island, but when that institution closed in 1968, not only the building went abandoned, but the entire island became abandoned, leaving the buildings, the belongings, and the history to marinate. But it didn't take long for history buffs and thrill seekers to check it out for themselves. And that's when the legend began to grow of how haunted Poveglia Island really was. I've actually watched a video of somebody not doing a ghost hunt here, but just exploring the island. I believe it was Exploring with Josh I watched, and it's kind of unfortunate because although the history of this island is rather dark, the architecture is still beautiful, and the island itself is really unique. I could only imagine it would be a cool tourist attraction, kind of like the Italian version of Alcatraz. You know how that had a really dark history but became a popular tourist attraction. Even though this entire island has been off limits from the day it closed to today, it's not stopped people from going. And it appears that almost everybody who has gone there has come back with a story, which has led to numerous different paranormal TV shows and even paranormal YouTubers to explore the island for themselves. There are no real famous notable claims of hauntings or specific apparitions on this island. There is just a general consensus among people who have been there that there is no doubt that this island is haunted, which they back up with the history of the building itself. This is definitely an example of a haunted location that I'd be more willing to take seriously simply because there's no financial incentive. This isn't something that somebody owns. Nobody's really gonna make money off of making a legend out of this. It is an abandoned building with a dark history that I'm sure the Italian government just wanted to kind of decay into nothingness. How to escape North Korea. North Korea is an elusive country, unlike any other. And while a lot of what happens in North Korea is a secret, the cruel cruelty, poverty, and human rights violations are definitely not hidden. North Korea is globally known for its poor treatment of its people and tyrannical dictator. However, the world seemingly just allows it. And that is a topic for a different discussion. But I mention this all to say that North Korea is not a good place. And for that reason, it's unsurprising that every single day people try to escape this country. Those people are known as defectors. The record of North Korean defectors goes all the way back to 1998, with a recorded count of 947 people escaping the country. From 1998 all the way up until 2011, we saw a rise in the amount of people that were able to escape, with a peak number of defectors of 2,914 in 2009. But after 2011, the number started to float around 1,500 and shrank all the way down to around 1,000 defectors in 2019. However, after 2019, the amount of people that were able to successfully escape plummeted. The reason for such a dramatic drop in escapees is North Korea enacted a shoot-on-sight order that essentially gave all Border Patrol the authority to shoot any person in the buffer zone surrounding North Korea who was there without permission. Escaping North Korea is scary and truly deadly, especially now more than ever. But for some living in North Korea, that risk is worth taking, and they'd rather die on the pursuit of freedom than living under the control of a dictator. Since 1998, there have been over 34,000 people in total who have been able to escape North Korea successfully. And today, I'm going to discuss some of the craziest ways that these people accomplished such a feat, starting tame and getting crazier as the list goes on. Leveraging wealth and social class. You are a high-ranking government official, specifically working with state-run businesses. You are one of the extremely rare, wealthy North Koreans, at least relatively, and you experience privileges many North Koreans could never dream of. Not only do you have a comfortable dwelling and consistent access to quality food and clean water, but you also have access to something that almost resembles freedom. You work tireless days, and sometimes even nights, and you are quite literally being worked to the bone. However, every day on your commute, you realize how grateful you are to be in the position you're in. And while you are grateful for your position, you understand that even the best position in North Korea still isn't all that great. And for some time, while on business, specifically in mainland China, you've seen the difference in quality of life, and you've been slowly taking notes on how you could potentially leave your job. Your job grants you a lot of authority, and you are well connected, not only with the North Korean government, but with government officials and high-ranking businessmen in China. One night, while drinking at a bar in mainland China, half asleep, a man sits beside you. He doesn't say anything, but he hands you his card. You tell this man that you're not on business hours and you appreciate it, but you're just looking to relax. And the man sternly looks you in the eyes and says, "I know you're North Korean, and if you ever want to start a new life, you call this number." This moment was sobering, as this man wasn't speaking to you in Mandarin. He was speaking fluent Korean. And before you could even ask another question, he got up and left. You wake up the following morning, early, hungover in this Chinese hotel. You briefly remember that crazy dream you had last night until you reach into your pocket and feel that you actually got that card and that wasn't a dream. You get in the taxi and make your way back to the airport. And on your way back to North Korea, the only thing you could think of is the offer this man gave you. You assume he had to be a defector, as no mainland Chinese person would speak such perfect Korean, specifically with a North Korean accent. And nobody would recognize the fact that you were North Korean or make you such a preposterous offer unless they were sure, likely because they were in a similar situation. You get home and you're happy to see your family. And after putting your children to bed and once again going to bed late, you sit beside your wife in bed and tell her a secret. You tell her that you met somebody in China and this person could change their lives. You explain to your wife who you met and what they offered, and you notice that your wife doesn't look enthusiastic. She looks shocked. And before you could ask your wife what she thought about the possibility of potentially starting a new life and leaving North Korea, she jumps out of bed and begins screaming. She is completely repulsed by the idea that she could potentially ever want to leave the greatest nation. And she's convinced that you must be brainwashed and that you must be reported to the government immediately. Your wife is either brainwashed or simply terrified of what could happen to her if her husband was testing her loyalty to North Korea, or if anybody happened to be listening. Regardless, your wife grabs the phone and immediately starts dialing. You grab the phone and tell her that you were kidding. You were kidding. You were only simply testing her because nobody loved North Korea more than you, and you wanted to test your wife's loyalty to North Korea to make sure your marriage was strong. This seems to calm your wife and you both go to bed. And it's at that moment when you realize that if you were to leave North Korea, you're doing it alone. Your next trip to mainland China isn't for another 6 months, but the following day at work, you convince your boss us that you have unfinished business in China, and it's best for the company if you return as soon as possible. The following week, the opportunity arises, and you're back in China. You take out the card and you give it a call. You meet the man at the same bar that you're at. After your first night in China, you call the number on the card that you were given, and you're met with an automated voice message saying coordinates and a cash value. You assume that the coordinates are where you're supposed to meet someone, and you assume that cash value is the fee required for your freedom. You meet up with this man once again, and over the course of the week you're supposed to be doing business, you get a fake Korean passport, and you are given a dedicated travel guide, aka your new wife, whose sole job is to get you to the airport safely and make sure that you are able to catch a flight from mainland China to South Korea. This isn't the woman's first rodeo, and she's able to get you through security checkpoints and past suspicious Chinese government officials, as her Chinese is perfect and her story for why she is hanging out with a South Korean man checks out. You get dropped off at the airport by this mysterious woman, and when she drops you off at the airport, she says, "Never come back." You board your flight to South Korea, and your new life has begun. So yeah, this is obviously a hypothetical story, but it's an example of exactly how someone could use their wealth, connections, and status to escape North Korea. This method of escape is the most effective, the safest, and also the least common, because privileged individuals in North Korea simply are hard to come by. And the percentage of those that would even consider leaving or betraying North Korea is even smaller. However, it has been done, and it needed to be mentioned. In this story I just told, I outlined a mysterious man, and this man represents a very real person and industry that exists, known as escape brokers. And their entire business model is essentially smuggling people out of North Korea, obviously for a hefty fine. However, if you're a wealthy individual, then that is a small price to pay for your freedom and for your safety, because the other methods of escape we're going to be discussing are not nearly as plush as this. The reason why this mysterious woman, who was an employee of this smuggling company, gave you a South Korean passport was, one, because it was a perfect excuse of why somebody in China would be speaking Korean, and secondly, because it raised no red flags of why a South Korean would be going to South Korea from China. If this man decided to fly from mainland China to South Korea with a North Korean passport, it is highly likely that the Chinese government would be extremely suspect of this and you would be questioned. Specifically because China has very close relations with North Korea, and also has a treaty in place where any escapees from North Korea that make it to China will be returned to North Korea by the Chinese government. So yeah, even if you are able to simply escape to China from North Korea by any means, you're definitely not free, but that's something we'll discuss later. The example I gave in the beginning focuses on businessmen or government officials who are able to essentially network with influential and powerful people and also have access to money. But there are other ways you can leverage class and status to escape, notably being high-level athletes or privileged students from these rich families who are able to both work and study abroad. In these cases, when you are out of North Korea, you can simply just not go home. And depending on where you are abroad, you can be protected, and in some cases even given citizenship as a refugee, allowing you to start a brand new life. One more thing I want to mention is the fact that in the story I gave, this character had kids. And if you're familiar with North Korean law, then you know that the North Korean government likes to punish not only you, but also your family for your crimes. And in the instance of the story I gave initially, the reason why the man was so able to confidently leave North Korea is because he used a high-level escapee broker. And one of his services that they include in their price is faking your death. So instead of being seen as an escapee by the North Korean government, this mysterious man was able to make it look like you died doing business abroad. And for that reason, your family is spared. And while this entire situation is hypothetical, the core of these conditions is based in reality. And while this man's family was spared in this instance, that is not always the case. One of the reasons this man was even allowed to travel internationally for business is because he had a family. And to the North Korean government, that is something that they see as collateral. Because if this man has a wife and kids, he is much less likely to just defect. Because the man knows that if he defects, his family will be tortured and killed on his behalf. And for most, that is reason enough to stay. Regardless, let's move on. International labor camps. You're a skinny, single, young man living in the northern part of North Korea. You're an orphan and you work on a farm. You've been working at this farm for as long as you can remember, and the people that live at this farm are the closest thing you have to family. But as you get older, it seems the worse the treatment gets, and it seems that the more work you put in, the less that you get paid. You're a full-grown man now, but the meals you get served are still the portion size you got when you were a child. And at this point, you're almost skin and bones. You've tried begging and pleading with the owners of this farm for more food, as they are the only ones providing your meals. However, they're not budging. They tell you should be grateful for what you get. And while they're not in any better of a situation, you realize that if you stay here, you're going to die. So one night, you plan your escape. Not from North Korea, but just from this farm. Under the veil of night, you escape on a dirt road with a burlap sack on your back and the rags that you've had for your entire life. You find yourself in a small village and soon realize that your money did not go nearly as far as you thought it would. So to conserve money, you decide to steal. And while it isn't like you at all, it's life or death, and you're able to justify it. And you fill your bag with food from a stand in the city square, from the village farmer's market. Before you could even close your bag, you feel 2 hands on your shoulder and turn around. It's a police officer. And good news, you'll have a place to sleep tonight. Bad news, you're going to jail. You're brought into jail, booked, and because of your retaliation, the punishment that you're given is 2 years in a labor camp in Russia. After 2 cruel weeks in a holding cell, you're put on a train and sent to northern Russia, where you're going to be spending the next 2 years on a lumber mill. You arrive at this mill and realize that this camp is almost fully employed by North Korean criminals, which gives you some relief as you at least have somebody to talk to, because you were expecting Russians. And while all of the guards are heavily armed Russians, those are really the only Russians around you, as this labor camp is in an extremely remote area. On your first night in the camp, you speak to one of the other North Koreans and he tells you that you came at the perfect time, and that him and the other men at this labor camp have been planning an escape for years. And tomorrow night was the night that they leave, and that if you are brave enough, you could come with. You had no intentions of leaving North Korea and ended up in Russia by accident, but at this point, you had nothing to lose. The cold weather was unbearable, you can't stand farm work anymore, and even dying at this point sounds better than working in a Russian labor camp. You tell the man you're in, and he says, "We'll wake you up tomorrow night." You work the next day and go to bed the next night, and like he said, in the middle of the night, this man wakes you up quietly. Similar to something you did yourself not long ago, under the veil of night, you and a small group of these North Korean prisoners set off in the middle of the night. Leaving the labor camp wasn't the hard part, as security was relatively low due to the location of this labor camp and the assumption that if anybody were to leave, they would be dead within days, as the closest civilization was multiple days away on foot. And all of these cities had police that specifically do checks for North Koreans. Walking through this frozen, barren wasteland, you ask this man, "What is the plan? Where are we going? If Russian police find us, we will be sent back to North Korea. They are allies." And that's when this man reveals his master plan. Some of the criminals you are with have been in this prison for so long that they speak fluent Russian. And because of the Russian that this prisoner picked up, in the months of listening to guards, they were essentially able to map out not only where the train tracks are, but the train schedule as well. After hours of walking in the darkness, day begins to break, and you notice that your group is already smaller. 2 of the men that were in your group initially were no longer, and it's mutually assumed that they fell behind and froze to death. You and your remaining men find the train tracks, wait for the next train taking wood out of the labor camp, hop on one of the very last carts, and you are now, once again, on your way to freedom. Wow. In this hypothetical, you're in a similar situation as the first person, but obviously on a much different scale. Because you didn't even intentionally go abroad, you were just sent abroad by the government, and you had no expectations of fleeing at all. You simply accepted your fate, but you were at the right place at the right time. And fortunately, the people that you trusted had the perfect plan. Did the person in this hypothetical have ridiculous plot armor? Of course. But I figured in these fictional scenarios, obviously based on reality, it would make sense to have them at least escape at the end of the story. Because if all the stories ended with, "and they were caught and killed," well, it's not really a good example of how to escape. It's how you could try to escape and then die, which is the unfortunate reality for most. But yeah, labor camps exist, and obviously they exist all over North Korea, but some of them are abroad, and they are primarily in Russia. And while nobody wants to be at a Russian labor camp, there are North Koreans who see going to a Russian labor camp as a golden opportunity to escape their country. And it's for that reason that the North Korean government is very stingy on who they send abroad. And in most cases, you're not going to be sent to an abroad labor camp. And the only reason why you in this story were even sent abroad is because you have farm experience, you've worked in cold conditions before because you lived in a northern part of North Korea, and according to your documents, you still had a living family, which is a requirement to be sent abroad. And obviously you were an orphan since birth and don't know any of your family. Legally speaking, you still had a living family, so the government assumed you had loyalty to them, which made you a much lower escapee risk. Of course, getting to Russia is similar to getting to China. You are not necessarily fully free in these countries. You're more free, but these are still countries that have close ties to North Korea. And you are at risk for being caught and being deported back to North Korea, where you'll be punished severely. And in this instance, you and the other criminals who made it to this train were taking a train that took you out of Russia and into Europe, as Europe has no allegiance to North Korea, much like the rest of the Western world. And if you're able to make it through Russia into a European country, and from there find a South Korean embassy, at that point, it's safe to say you're safe and are going to win yourself a one-way ticket to South Korea. The reason why South Korea is so desirable for North Koreans is because South Korea gives automatic citizenships to North Korean escapees, and at least the government accepts these people with open arms. Socially, there is definitely polarity on how people treat defectors, but a bit of scrutiny for being North Korean is definitely better than living in North Korea. So at this point, let's reconsider. Obviously, going north isn't ideal, because if you use the small border that borders North Korea and Russia, not only is it extremely well guarded, cold, and far from any sort of safe haven, it's only really a good option for those looking to get into a labor camp, as being sent to a labor camp allows you to cross the border safely. And now we also understand that going through China, another country that borders North Korea, is also not ideal because that border, once again, is highly guarded. And because of the connection that China has with North Korea, you're essentially still in North Korea until you're out of China, which means that you have a long ways to travel before you can really take a breath and relax. But that leaves the natural question. What about the last country that borders North Korea? Why not escape to the country that everybody wants to go, that gives you immediate asylum and citizenship? South Korea is literally connected to North Korea. It's not freezing cold. It's a country that will accept you. And this country also has people that speak the same language as you. It seems like the perfect way to escape. And while on paper, you're definitely right, there's one major issue. You're not the only person that understands this. The North Korean government understands this quite dearly. And that's why there's a demilitarized zone that stretches the entire land border of North Korea and South Korea. And while that name seems semi-safe, it's extremely deceptive, as this border is not demilitarized at all. It is very militarized. There is so much military from both North and South Korea. There is literally hundreds of thousands of soldiers on either side of this border, and in the area in between these two countries, there is active landmines, electric fences, and watchtowers with the executive order to shoot on sight. So let's get into our third and final story to outline likely the craziest and deadliest way you could escape North Korea. Escaping by land as a regular North Korean citizen. You, like many other North Koreans, are simply sick and tired of being sick and tired, and you decide you're gonna make a run for it. You live near a remote part of the border, where there are active personnel, but it's not as heavily monitored as other places. You pack a bag and set out on foot, feeling confident that you can make this land crossing. You don't see anybody, and you figure this is gonna be a walk in the park, and after hours of walking, you realize that you don't even exactly know where the border is, and for all you know, you might already be in South Korea. You walk further and further, and finally begin to feel free. You must have at this point passed the border, until you see something in the distance. You walk closer to it and you realize that it's a sign that says active minefield. And it's at this point that you realize that you are much further from the border than you thought, and you have a long ways to go. You call the sign's bluff and continue walking. And after taking a few steps and walking for 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes, you knew there was no mines and continue walking. And you're right, there was no mines, but there was snipers. Snipers that you didn't see, but they saw you. And before you can even blink, you hear a gunshot and everything goes black. Unfortunately, that is a reality for people trying to cross the land border between North and South Korea. Crossing over the water as a regular North Korean citizen. You're a young woman fed up with living in North Korea. You've been abused your whole life, and at this point, you feel that anything is better than your current existence. You've studied geography in school and understand that the waters on the west coast of North Korea where you live are much more favorable than the east coast for fishermen. But if fishermen favor it, must be a reason, and the waters must be calmer, which must mean it's easier to escape. One night you head down to a local dock and brazenly steal a boat. You simply head south and plan on running into the South Korean Coast Guard. Although hours into your trip on this boat, you get caught up in a storm and you lose your motor. At this point, you're stranded at sea at the mercy of the ocean. There's essentially 3 outcomes that are possible, and I'll just go through them quickly. Option 1, you wash up on shore. You think you're in South Korea, but you're actually still in North Korea, and you're killed. The tide takes you north, and you wash up on shore in China, where you are found by police, deported to North Korea, and killed. Or, if you are extremely fortunate, you do wash up on shore in South Korea and begin a new life. Or, option 4, you lose your life at sea, either due to harsh conditions or by being caught by the North Korean Navy, which heavily patrol these waters because of people like yourself. escaping via the land border as military personnel. The story I'm about to tell is not a fictional hypothetical like the others. The story I'm about to tell is a real story about a real individual and is likely one of the craziest known escape stories from North Korea into South Korea. Oh Chung-sung was a high-ranking military official in North Korea who was also an industrial engineer. He had a good job and was considered good at that job, but obviously he wasn't satisfied. And one day, he met his breaking point and was willing to risk his life for his freedom. On the morning of November 13th, 2017, Sung stole a military jeep from the military base where he worked, heading directly for the demilitarized zone, the area between North and South Korea, aiming to get into South Korea and begin a new life, in a way that is regarded as likely the most dangerous way. Although Sung did have an advantage, being military personnel, he was able to be very close to the border. He had security access and a relatively comprehensive knowledge of how things worked. Although, even with all of the knowledge in the world, you need luck and likely God on your side to even make this possible. And on this morning, Sung definitely had both. Sung sped this military jeep directly at the border, crashing through fences and driving right through no man's land. And while approaching freedom and seemingly having a perfect escape, his car lost a wheel. He hit a ditch on the side of the road and was immobile, and had to continue his escape on foot. Sung was close to the border, but he did have North Korean officials tailing him closely, and they were shooting to kill. Sung officially crossed the border, although with 5 bullet holes in his body, and was able to crawl behind a small barrier where he collapsed and stayed seemingly lifeless for hours. Later that day, the South Korean military conducted a rescue operation and strategically transported him via air to a hospital and saved his life. In the hospital, it was discovered that he was shot 5 times and lost over half of his blood, and that if he did not receive this emergency surgery, he would have died there. Sung's story is extremely well documented, and this entire situation was actually caught on camera due to the sheer amount of surveillance on the North and South Korean border. And Sung is definitely one of the luckiest people to ever cross the North Korean border illegally. If you are living in North Korea currently, well, truthfully, you're not watching this video. But if you're curious about how people have successfully and unsuccessfully escaped North Korea in the past, hopefully this video gave you a bit of context, and did so in a way that was entertaining due to the hypothetical stories that I basically just made up, but obviously based on reality, for the most part. How to survive a nuclear bomb. As you stand there helplessly, the only thing you can see is the one thing that will destroy everything you've ever known and loved. But interestingly, in that moment of morbid tranquility, you ask yourself, could all of this have just been prevented? And if not, is there any possible way you could survive? To answer that question fully, we need to take a few steps backwards to get the full picture, and then let the entire situation play out, ideally with a happy ending, if such a thing is even possible. It was a regular Friday afternoon. You were sitting on the couch, doom-scrolling Instagram Reels, and you had the TV on just for some background noise. Everything felt right in the world until you were met with the ear-piercing screech of a television announcement. Quickly, almost as if it were hacked, your television goes from showing Wheel of Fortune to showing text on screen. And this text is met with an ominous voice telling you that intercontinental ballistic missiles have been launched directly at your country. And this was your one and only warning from the government, that you have 30 minutes to prepare and seek shelter, because after that 30 minutes, the world will never be the same. Instantly, thoughts are flooding through your brain. What are my first steps? Can I survive this explosion? Can I survive what happens after the explosion? And if I can survive both of those, can I survive what the world looks like after all the dust is finally settled? In this video, we're going to answer all of those questions, going step by step on exactly how you could survive a nuclear blast, nuclear fallout, and an extended nuclear winter. In this hypothetical situation, let's begin. The nuclear blast. So you just got the news. You have exactly 30 minutes until bombs are detonated in your exact area. And at this point, you're trying to find your next best steps, which ideally involves survival. But to see if survival is even possible, you must first understand the size of the bomb that is on its way to you and your proximity to where the bomb will be detonating. In a real-life situation, these two pieces of information would be luxuries you would likely not have access to. But for the sake of this hypothetical, let's just assume you do. Let's begin by focusing on that first variable. The type, or more specifically, size of the bomb is going to play one of the most important roles on your exact chances of survivability. The 2 nuclear bombs that were dropped on Japan at the end of World War II are great points of reference because they are some of the most notable and studied explosions in modern history, at least in a non-controlled environment. But believe it or not, in the world of nuclear bombs, both Little Boy and Fat Man are relatively modest in the context of total nuclear bomb capabilities. And I say that in the most respectful and sensitive way possible. Obviously, hundreds of thousands of lives were lost due to those bombs. But even the smaller of those two bombs, the little boy, only had a payload of roughly 15 kilotons, which, while massive, doesn't even hold a candle to the biggest airburst nuclear bomb ever tested, which would be the Tsar Bomba, an airburst nuclear bomb that had a payload of 50 megatons. And while it's kind of hard to explain, visuals don't lie. On screen is a graphic between the blast radius of a little boy versus the Tsar Bomba. As you can see, the Tsar Bomba has a much more devastating impact. And if you are trying to survive that, well, you're basically not, unless you are so far away from it that it wouldn't even affect you in the first place. Which, in the context of the Tsar Bomba, would have to be over at least 100 kilometers away, ideally closer to 300 plus kilometers away from the direct blast site. Now, with that being noted and said, let's use a more modest example for the sake of this video to keep things a little bit interesting. Assuming that you've been quickly able to find out that the bomb about to land in your general location is a 15 kiloton airburst nuclear device, a bomb basically identical to the little boy, you understand that while danger is imminent, there are chances of survival if you act accordingly. And fortunately for you, while still on the couch, you hear on the TV advice from the government. And they're telling you that your best chances of survival are to seek immediate shelter. Ideally in a concrete building far away from exterior walls or roofs, with deep, solid basements being the most ideal location. I guess besides actual fallout shelter, but assuming you don't have a fallout shelter, that's where you want to be. So quickly, you follow the device and go deep into your basement cellar and open up your phone to see exactly where the bomb is going to land, as this is truly what's going to determine your chances of survival. After opening your phone and checking the map, you can see that it's estimated that this airburst is going to land roughly downtown in your city, which for you is only 500 meters away. And while you may not be in the direct blast zone, you're definitely not in the clear. And it's actually times like this where people can make a fatal mistake. You see, looking at a blast radius, you can see that there is different areas of damage. There is the radius in which the initial fireball will reach. There is the radius where the initial heavy blast where the most damage will happen will reach. And then of course there is the radius in which the radiation will reach. And then there are the radiuses of the moderate to low damage sites and the extended thermal blast radius. All of which coming with their own unique dangers and ways to survive them. And the honest truth is, while it may seem intuitive at first to try to get as far away as you can from the initial blast site, that is typically not recommended for a number of reasons. For starters, by the time that you are aware of an ICBM coming your way, you will likely not be able to make a meaningful amount of distance between yourself and the bomb site due to limited time, and on top of that, in most cases, roads will jam instantly. And even if there is no traffic whatsoever, if you are actively driving out in the open and vulnerable, you could be unintentionally driving yourself into the fallout zone simply because you don't know which way the wind is going to take the fallout. So while you may be driving away from the blast site, you could be driving to the exact place where all the fallout is going to settle, making yourself extremely vulnerable and essentially sealing your fate. The only instances where it's truly recommended to actually try to escape a nuclear explosion, at least prior to its detonation, is if you are already tens of miles away outside of the detonation site and have also been given clear evacuation instructions by officials. And this has been proven in hypothetical scenarios where they have had 10 kiloton detonations in a city setting. But focusing back in on your situation, assuming you were able to find a cement cellar in your basement and you were able to confirm that you were in a danger zone but not the most dangerous zone, now you play the waiting game. Because as long as the structure you're in is sturdy and secure, you are very likely to be protected from all of the different hazards that are about to be instantly present with the detonation of this nuclear bomb, including the fireball, the heavy blast, the radiation, the thermal radiation, and even the extended moderate blast and radiation damage. And while in this hypothetical, once the detonation happens, you might be as safe as you can be, that is not going to be the case for everybody. And unfortunately, tens, if not hundreds of thousands will die, depending on how heavily populated your city is. In your makeshift cellar, you were able to survive the initial detonation because you were out of the initial heavy blast zone, out of the fireball radius, and in the safest place you could possibly be. However, let me quickly explain what would happen to you if you happened to try to escape or were potentially in other areas, either closer or farther from that radius. If you happen to be exactly downtown at the immediate detonation site, outside and completely vulnerable, you would instantly be killed by a massive fireball. That is you and everybody else in a radius of roughly 180 meters. Assuming you weren't downtown particularly, but you're in a park just outside of downtown, call it 300 meters, you would be out of the fireball radius, but you would still be in the heavy blast damage radius. In this radius, almost every above ground structure is going to be leveled, and that includes you. The sheer force of the blast itself is enough to rupture your lungs and stop your heart almost instantly upon contact, meaning that you wouldn't really be able to see the bomb as much as you would be a near instant casualty of it. But let's assume you were even further away. Let's say that you were over a kilometer away from the detonation site of a 15 kiloton nuclear explosion, twice as far away as your friend in the bunker. If you were a kilometer away, outside, and vulnerable, unfortunately, you would still be at a major risk of death. And by that, I mean almost guaranteed death. And that's because even though at this distance you'd likely be able to see the initial explosion and see the mushroom cloud form, you are by no means safe. The initial detonation of the bomb, even at this distance, would likely blind you temporarily. The shockwave, which wouldn't take long to reach you, while it wouldn't be considered heavy at this distance, it would still be considered moderate, meaning that shockwave alone would be enough to at least burst your eardrums, as well as cause significant damage to your surroundings. But in case being blind and deaf wasn't bad enough, you still have the thermal radiation to deal with. Basically, the massive heat blast that comes off of the nuclear bomb. And this heat blast, even a kilometer out from the detonation site, would leave you with third-degree burns from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. But in most cases, this wouldn't even be an issue, because you wouldn't be alive to experience the pain of having all of those symptoms. However, if you were able to survive all of that, you would definitely not be able to survive what's about to happen next. But before we get to that, let's summarize where we're at. The first step to surviving a nuclear bomb, fallout, and winter is of course surviving the bomb's detonation. And as we've learned, your best chances of survival are simply getting as deep as you can, ideally in the most fortified building you can find. And beyond taking those intentional actions, there's really not much more you can do, besides praying and hoping that you're in a building that's strong enough and you're in a location that's far enough from the detonation site to allow you to survive it. And while it may seem overly simple or rudimentary, realistically, when you're discussing surviving nuclear bombs, there truly isn't many more options besides ducking and praying. And assuming in your case those two steps work for you, let's discuss what happens after the initial blast. Nuclear fallout. During the explosion, while you were in your bunker hearing what could only be described as the end of the world outside, you were at least safe and able to survive the initial blast. And while individuals 2 to 3 times further away from the detonation site who didn't seek the same shelter as you or weren't able to find the same shelter as you could have possibly survived, the reality is, even if they did, they wouldn't have wanted to, because of the sheer hell caused by these bombs as I described previously. You're in your cellar, you can tell that the house above you is leveled, and while your ears are ringing and your anxiety is at an all-time high, you are at least alive. And the big question is, what do you do next? It might seem like you have just won the lottery and you have survived the easiest part. You literally survived a nuclear bomb. But unfortunately, the hell has only begun, not ended. And at this point, you have only about 10 to 15 minutes before fallout begins falling from the sky. Nuclear fallout is essentially residual radioactive material that has been shot into the sky from the explosion, cooling in the atmosphere, and then falling back to the ground. This highly radioactive dirt and ash takes roughly 15 to 20 minutes to fall from the atmosphere to the ground, and in some cases, it's actually this fallout that can be just as deadly, if not deadlier, than the initial explosion. Typically, this fallout will fall in a radius around the detonation site. However, it's usually not a perfect circle due to wind conditions. And this wind, like we described in the first section, can actually take this nuclear fallout far away from the detonation site, affecting people that thought they were perfectly safe, making it even more dangerous. If you were somebody who was caught above ground and survived the initial explosion, now is your last chance to get underground. Because doing snow angels in radioactive fallout will not give you superpowers. It'll actually give you radiation poisoning that will kill you within hours to weeks depending on your exposure. Early signs of radiation sickness include vomiting and intense fatigue and headache. And if you were unfortunate enough to be outside, coming in direct contact with nuclear fallout, and then feel these symptoms on set, it's safe to say that in a short amount of time, you'll be kissing your life goodbye. However, if you were outside for the explosion but were able to make it inside before the fallout, the first thing you want to do is immediately secure the premises. Block any air vents, block any windows, change your clothes ideally, and even shower if possible. And at that point, you're basically in the same position as your friend who was in the bunker the whole time. Speaking of which, for the individuals that were in bunkers during the explosion, the only thing that you have to do at this point is wait. As the fallout begins to fall only 20 minutes after the explosion, the radioactive material quickly begins to decay. And that's because this radioactive fallout is strong but has a very short half-life. And it's been reported that in the first hour alone, over half the radiation is gone. And over the course of the next 24 to 48 hours, levels drop significantly, although not enough to go outside quite yet. After 48 hours, 80% of the radioactive energy is gone, although it is still deadly. And after 2 weeks, the radioactive energy is still present, although it's only 1% of what it originally was. In a situation like this, the United States government recommends staying in your safe place as long as physically possible. And while there, tuning into a radio broadcast and waiting for further instructions. And unfortunately, once again, that's basically all you can do. When will the broadcast come? Who knows? What will the broadcast say? No idea. And the only thing you can hope for is that you have enough supplies within your direct cellar or safe space to sustain the life of yourself and the ones around you long enough to receive those instructions and be able to act on them. Sitting in a dark basement listening to the radio might seem like a small price to pay to survive a literal nuclear blast. However, it's important to note that if the structure that you're in is compromised or not fully safe, meaning that it's primarily wood or plaster or not fully cement or well ventilated, in that 2-week period of time when you are waiting for the radiation to lose its potency and also waiting for further instructions, you could very easily still contract radiation sickness in your safe space if it is not a totally ideal environment. And unfortunately, in most cases, you won't know until it's too late and you start showing signs of radiation sickness. So to recap, after you are able to withstand the initial shock, blast, fireball, and everything that comes with a nuclear explosion, you then have to do, well, nothing. If you were fortunate enough to be informed and fortunate enough to have a safe enough environment that could withstand the blast, or is at least far enough away from the blast, you were already extremely lucky. And now all you need to do is wait at least 2 weeks in this basement to safely be able to venture out into the outside world. However, if after 2 weeks you still haven't received any sort of radio correspondence from your government, it's safe to say that things have gone very wrong. And sitting, starving, and dying in your shelter in that situation might just be better than seeing what the world outside holds in store for you. And while the topic of a nuclear winter is more of a hypothesis than something we've seen in practice, I figured it'd be worth at least mentioning to see how you could or would not be able to survive it. Nuclear winter. Everything we've described so far is kind of under the assumption that only one nuclear bomb was detonated. And I described in those cases, if you are informed and lucky, you can get into a safe location, stay there, and ideally in a timely fashion receive life-saving instructions from your government that allows you to evacuate, survive, and slowly over time rebuild and get your life back to normal. However, what if that never happened? What if it wasn't just one bomb, and what if it was a full, all-out global nuclear war? Well, the hypothesized result of that would be a nuclear winter, which, while it's not something we've seen yet, scientists believe that it's actually a severe global event that would be the result of a large-scale nuclear war. Something that, while hasn't happened yet, isn't totally impossible. Interestingly, a nuclear winter isn't necessarily caused by the explosions of these nukes themselves. It's actually caused by all of the dirt, debris, soot, and carbon matter that gets put into the atmosphere from both the bombs and also the large-scale wildfires that is caused by the explosions. Like we've discussed, these nuclear bombs create a lot of heat. So much heat, in fact, that there is a radius around the blast site where the temperature of the Earth, for a brief moment, reaches the same temperature as the surface of the sun. And in this area and surrounding areas, fires are common. And when you have fires taking place in massive urban environments, especially in locations all across the globe, in the event of global nuclear war, you can see how this scale of all of the ash and soot and debris gets into the atmosphere and then begins to block sunlight, drop global temperatures, and truly change life as we know it. In 2023, for example, there was massive wildfires in Canada that for a brief period of time turned the entirety of New York City orange. It also caused the entire city to smell like burnt wood and also made the air quality extremely bad. That's definitely not a direct comparison to what a nuclear winter could look like, but that is an example of how ash in the atmosphere can quickly change the ecosystem of a location. And in the case of a nuclear winter, where there is so much ash and soot in the atmosphere that so much sunlight is blocked, it won't take long for global temperatures to drop and a sustained environmental impact to happen. In the past 1,000 years, there have been things known as regional little ice ages that have been documented in different parts of the world. For example, from 1300 to 1800 in Europe, it was documented that there was a little ice age due to volcanic eruptions that put ash in the atmosphere, causing temperatures to drop regionally. And these drops in temperature not only scared people, but also killed crops, killed livestock, and ultimately killed people with only a slight decrease in sunlight and average temperatures. And while that's a bit of an oversimplification, the video I made about the worst times to be born goes much more into detail about that, and I'll link it in the description to watch after if you're interested. But assuming a full-blown nuclear winter is as severe, if not more severe, than a couple volcanic eruptions, then we have a decent picture on what this scenario could look like. In the case of a full-blown nuclear winter, within weeks of these large-scale fires burning, sending soot into the stratosphere, the sunlight would gradually dim, temperatures would begin to drop, and what would normally feel like a warm spring day would quickly feel like a brisk autumn night. Crops that previously fed the world would die, livestock that would sustain millions would die, and the reality of food scarcity would become daunting. Even with significantly less mouths to feed in the event of a nuclear winter, food scarcity would still be a massive problem as the supply is now limited. There is realistically no way to produce more food in a world where sunlight cannot sustain the growth of plants, and therefore animals cannot be farmed or bred. In the early stages of a nuclear winter, your best chance of survival would be either having a massive stockpile of food at your disposal already, or quickly joining forces with other survivors and beginning to loot and homestead, helping protect each other, sustain each other, and gathering food, and rationing whatever food you have sparingly. But if you've ever played a Fallout game, you know how easy it is to get along with people in an apocalyptic wasteland. That is, not at all. The long-term reality of a nuclear winter would result in multiple years of relying solely on the world's best stockpile or immense survival skills and technical know-how, as well as the mental fortitude of a Navy SEAL. Because while scrounging for food is one thing, living in a radioactive wasteland is something completely different. And the reality of the entire world in that scenario would essentially send you back to the Dark Ages, with remnants of modern-day technology. And it would be up to you and the rest of the survivors to slowly rebuild civilization as we once knew it. Beginning to reintroduce agriculture as the sun begins to re-emerge years into the winter, making makeshift electronics powered by batteries and wind turbines that you can leverage to do small tasks, and establishing trade and social hierarchy, two things we didn't have to worry about establishing since the Bronze Age. But yeah, while surviving a nuclear blast can be as simple as going into a bomb shelter or staying in a highly fortified basement, and then surviving the following fallout could be done successfully by then staying in said shelter, when you get onto the topic of nuclear winter, all of that kind of goes out the window. And it almost makes you ask yourself, if that's the world you're going to emerge to, is it even worth leaving that shelter or even going in the first place? And while I can't answer that question for you, it's just an interesting thought experiment, mostly because it's the most hypothetical and open-ended. And that's why there's an entire video game franchise and now TV show about living in a post-apocalyptic world. That, of course, being the Fallout franchise. And there's no game specifically about surviving the bomb itself or the fallout, because realistically, nobody wants to play a game where you hide in a cement basement for 14 days. That's the lifestyle of a true gamer, not a game a gamer wants to play. But regardless, bros, that's it for me. If you guys are ever curious on what it would take to potentially survive a nuclear blast, nuclear fallout, or even potentially a nuclear winter, I hope this video has been informative or at least entertaining.